To the Chamber, welcome to this event hosted jointly by the Portfolio Committee on Police and the Civilian Secretariat on Police. Honourable Members of Parliament, the Acting Secretary of the Civilian Secretariat, Chair of the Gender Committee, Heads of Department, CEOs of state institutions, distinguished guests and participants, ladies and gentlemen, fellow South Africans. I'm honoured to welcome you on behalf of the Portfolio Committee on Police and the Civilian Secretariat on Police, who is co-hosting the summit. To our invited guests, I would like to assure you that the Committee and the Secretariat values your presence in the summit. Your active participation in the discussions is essential for the next 2 days. The Committee wishes to express its gratitude to you and for your willingness to draw on your vast and different expertise and experiences to enrich the discussions. I just maybe want to introduce Mr. Eldred de Klerk. He's going to be our facilitator for the next 2 days to guide the discussions and also host the panels and also the question sessions. So thank you for him for that task. Maybe to refer briefly to all the invitees and as well the participants today. Maybe first I must maybe introduce the members of the Portfolio Committee on Police. Remember, it's a new Portfolio Committee on Police that was introduced in May last year. There's only 3 members of the Committee of the 4th Parliament. So the members can just stand when I mention their names. It's Honourable Angie Molabatsi. She is her second term on the committee, third term on the committee, third term. Then we've got Ms. Pindele Mamula, thank you very much. Then we've got Honourable Zach Mbele. Then we've got Honourable Kola Barnard, Diane Kola Barnard. She's also a second or third term on the committee. And then Honourable Pieter Groenewald. That is the members of the Portfolio Committee. Some others will also join us during the next 2 days. Then the government departments, we've got, as I indicated, the Civilian Secretariat. I don't know whether the Acting Secretary, Ms. Reniva Fourie, has joined us yet, but she will also be joining us. And then the South African Police Service. I already see General Sitole here today. Welcome to him. General Cruiser and General Major Mhlala, welcome to them. The National Commissioner will be joining us tomorrow in the proceedings, and also welcome to the rest of the SAPS delegation. Then, very importantly, the Firearms Appeal Board, Mr. Mongwe. Where are you? Very important. Thank you very much also for your delegation. It's also an institution that plays a very important role, and we also would like your inputs. Then we've got all the provincial secretariats of the various provinces on safety and security. So welcome to them as well. Metro Police, I've seen the Chief of Cape Town, also Irkeleni, and also KZN. Welcome to them as well. Welcome, and we're looking forward to your participation in the proceedings today. Then we've got the private security regulator, Mr. Chauki and his team. Welcome. Very important role play as well. Then we've got also members of the SAFA Senzo Mejia Gun Control Committee. I've seen Advocate Norman Arendse, SC, welcome to him. I don't know what other members of SAFA's executive, they'll be joining us during the course of the day, I presume. So welcome to them as well. We're looking forward also to their input. Then, very importantly, the Sports Shooting Fraternity. And we've got the Sports Shooting Forum. We've got also the SA Defensive Pistol Association, representatives from them. And South African Defensive Pistol Association. If I left anybody out, please alert us during the discussions. Welcome to them as well. Then the Training Council, the Professional Firearms Training Council, Mr. Pretorius and Baker. Are they here? Hopefully they will join us. Maybe the traffic plays a role. Then the SA Hunters and Game Conservation Association. Mr. Comfer, is he here? Mr. Fred Comfer, welcome. Then the arms and ammunition dealers, there's 2, 3 or 4 of them coming. The collectors, the gun owners associations, there's 3 or 4. But I mean, during the discussions, please introduce yourself. Trade unions, we've got SAPU, as well as a strong delegation from POPCRU. Welcome to them. their members play an important role, and we also want to have their input. Then research institutions, we've got, I saw Dr. Johan Berger of the Institute of Security Studies here. We've got WITS, we've got UCT, the CSVR, the Social Justice Coalition, Business Against Crime, the Security Industry Alliance. Also welcome to them. I saw Mr. Conradi, Stephen Conradi. Welcome to him as well. Then we've got the Legal Resources Centre, Gun Free South Africa, APCOF, SA Security Industry. Then there's also a host of others, Nidefundo Nakwazi, Mr. Oosthuizen, I saw you here this morning. Yeah, and of course, welcome as well to the media for attending. If I left anybody out, we will hear from you during the course of the deliberations. Now, maybe to indicate that in terms of Section 42 of the Constitution of the Republic, the following is said about the role of the National Assembly and then specifically portfolio committees. It is elected to represent the people and to ensure government by the people under the Constitution, inter alia by providing a national forum for public consideration of issues. This is precisely what we want to achieve the next 2 days, a national forum for public consideration of issues with relation to firearms. Maybe just to indicate and give a timeline to the delegates, the new Portfolio Committee on Police that was inducted in May 2014 had various meetings already on the issue of firearms management, the role and capacity of the Central Firearms Registry and the Firearms Appeal Board. And I just want to refer to that. The committee received a briefing from the SAPS management on 3 September 2014 on action plans regarding the Central Arms Fire Registry. This committee also visited the Central Firearms Registry on 22 September last year, and the committee resolved during that visit that the SAPS management should provide the committee with specific timelines in terms of the execution of the action plans. And we'll have tomorrow the National Commissioner of Police, General Riapiega, to speak to that. Now, the committee also adopted a report on that visit, and that the report will be debated in the National Assembly during the next parliamentary term that starts in April. And then on 5 November 2014, the committee received a briefing from the Civilian Secretariat on police with regard to the Firearms Control Amendment Bill. We've got Mr. Amishan Souman here from the Civilian Secretariat, who's also involved in the legislation. Welcome to him. And at the 5th November 2014 meeting, the Portfolio Committee resolved to host a national dialogue or summit on firearms in South Africa, looking at the following matters: the current firearm regime in SADC countries, the state of firearm management in South Africa and other SADC countries, the debate in the broader civil society and communities on firearms, broader holistic issues of education, the impact of illegal firearms in communities, as well as matters with relation to safety. I must just maybe indicate also the tragic incident of the killing of the Bafana captain played also a huge role in the committee's putting this on the national agenda, and we appreciate also the role of SAFA and their contribution in that regard. And the committee felt that it was important to assess the current environment, gaps in the current legislation, gaps at the Firearms Registry, SAP's capacity, budgetary provisions to ensure the effective implementation of legislation. Now, members of the committee was encouraged at the said meeting to invite role players, and so if you're here today, it's because of the input also of the members of the Portfolio Committee that you were invited. Now, in the budget review and the recommendation report of the Portfolio Committee on Police, dated 31 October 2014, the following recommendations were made. The committee recommended that the SAPS implement anti-corruption measures at the Central Firearms Registry and provides it with a full report on the implementation of these measures. A special hearing was also scheduled to deal with the measures. The Portfolio Committee also required an updated document on the progress of the turnaround strategy for the Central Firearms Registry. The Portfolio Committee also recommended that the SAPS review its IT systems with respect to firearm license applications and report back on a quarterly basis. The Portfolio Committee will have a hearing on this specific matter on 3 June 2015. And I maybe want to invite organizations and individuals who are here today also to participate in that process. So the next 2 days is therefore not a discussion to focus only on the Firearms Amendment Bill. That is a separate process, and interested parties have until the end of March to submit their input and comments to the Civilian Secretariat on Police. It is expected that the input and comments will be taken in consideration before the bill goes back to Cabinet. The bill will then be formally tabled in Parliament and then be referred to the Portfolio Committee on Police for processing, hopefully by middle June 2015. During that process, ample opportunity would be given to interested parties and individuals for comment and oral testimony. The proceedings of the next 2 days is therefore aimed to promote a national dialogue on the South Africa that we want in 2030, a society where all people are and feel safe. The minimum criteria that would assist in bringing violent crime down, the presence of firearms in our society, the role of the citizenry in the process, and judging from a GFSA position paper on the data of the SAP's annual reports, data of the Central Firearms Registry and parliamentary questions in the last 3 years, civilians have lost between 15 and 28 guns every day, and the police officers between 2 and 5 guns per day. Yeah, Adele Kirsten of Gun Free South Africa, welcome also to you and your delegation. What should the SAPS do more to ensure that the CFR environment is properly addressed? What are the role and responsibilities of firearm owners and dealers? How can we all contribute to a South Africa where all are and feel safe? Let us aim to develop a fresh approach on the key challenges affecting the public and government departments in dealing with firearms and outcomes that will be the benefit of all key sectors involved in the process. Thank you for attending. We trust that the discussions would be productive and fruitful. Thank you very much.
Good morning. So I have to say that in all level languages. Surely be a test of my citizenship and my patriotism. I think I can get away with about 4 or 5, but having said good morning and welcome, let me just say all protocol reserved, or what do we say? All protocol observed, not reserved. It's a peculiarly South African expression, and I'm very grateful for it, because invariably in identifying the people around the room and thanking all institutions, you're bound to leave a few people out. So I think as South Africans we've learned to cover all our bases. The one exciting thing about the next 2 days is that we have the right people in the room. You are the leadership to address the question that's been put to you by Mr. Björkman. And the Honorable Björkman has simply asked us, what kind of society do we want to build and live in towards 2030? Now 2030 we've set ourselves as a milestone in terms of our planning, in terms of government's effort, and what it expects the roles and responsibility of its citizens, us, you and I. And today you have been asked to exercise leadership in addressing that question, to bring your insights, knowledge, experience and understanding, particularly of the firearms environment and its impact on society, to bear on this very central question. So it's an opportunity for us to listen and be heard. It's an opportunity for us to build a mutual understanding and knowledge and insight. It's an opportunity for us to educate each other, to build some broad consensus, and it's an opportunity to exercise example and leadership, as I've already said. So in fostering this mutual understanding, insight and knowledge, we've given ourselves 2 days. In those 2 days we will have certain inputs, and those inputs will range from a regional input, which Guy Lamb will give, to what is government's responsibility in terms of exercising oversight, regulating and legislating the environment of firearms. Firearms, legal or otherwise, illegal or otherwise, have an impact on society, and all of us here can attest to that. So we'll have a panel on what's the impact of guns and the gun culture on our society, and whatever that is. We'll also then look later in the afternoon towards strategies to reduce particularly illegal firearms in our society, because that is a concern. Tomorrow, we'll have a different program, focusing much more on discussion and drawing from your knowledge, insight, and expertise. Today, unfortunately, we will not have the Minister of Police with us. The Honourable Minister will join us tomorrow with the Deputy Minister, so we'll have a lot more time, or much more time, for discussion, which is a good thing. Because it's not about the talking heads up here, it's about the richness that is in the room. It's about the 2 days that you have gifted us and each other, and how productively we use that time. Because it is a gift. You could be with your families, you could be doing all kinds of other things. So we want to thank you. Thank you for your time, and thank you for your participation. It will be my pleasure and privilege to try to facilitate that dialogue in a way that we can walk away proud South Africans, with broad consensus, some agreements, and some targeted outcomes. So I look forward to that discourse and discussion, and I look forward to being part of that dialogue. And thank you once again for availing us of your time. Guy Lamb, you actually need no introduction. Guy and I have worked together at the Center for Conflict Resolution a long time ago. And Guy has been working on the issue of small arms throughout Africa and elsewhere for over 20 years. It was my baptism of fire when it came to the notion of small arms, and traveling to the rest of Africa and looking at the impact, particularly on small arms across the continent. So Guy, you can say a lot more about yourself, and welcome. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Aldred. Just a technical question, who's going to drive the PowerPoint? Is there a remote, or is there someone who's going to drive the PowerPoint? Because I suppose that's an issue for all. I see that the PowerPoint laptop is over there. Unless there's someone who can do it, or the laptop can move here. I mean, if it's got an extension cord, that might be easier.
Otherwise we'll give it to you. It's got an extension.
If it's got an extension, that might be easier. Okay. I'll say next slide, but I need the next slide. Okay. Thanks, Tembani. Good morning, everyone. Honourable Chair, honourable members of the Portfolio Committee, ladies and gentlemen. It's indeed a pleasure and an honour to be here. I didn't expect to be the first presenter, but I've been given a fairly, hopefully, uncontroversial topic to discuss. But I want to talk about legislation, but also the impact of legislation within Southern Africa, but also beyond it. And I'll talk about why I want to talk beyond it later. At the moment, I'm Director of the Safety and Violence Initiative at the University of Cape Town, which is one of 4 strategic initiatives the university launched a few years ago to try and get scholarship increasingly more engaged in social issues. So issues such as safety and violence, climate change, education, and poverty. And so it's an attempt to do interdisciplinary research, which is to bring together all parts of the university to focus on an issue that cuts across. So within the Safety and Violence Initiative, some of my colleagues are in the room, particularly Sebastian van As. It's about combining surgeons with sociologists, with criminologists, with psychiatrists, psychologists, lawyers, people who focus on the rights of children, and social workers. So it's really trying to get us the best possible perspective on issues on safety and violence. And one of the things that we do look at is lethal violence and homicide, or amongst a range of other issues on safety and violence. But today, I'm talking a bit about stuff from my past, which is before joining the university, I was with the Institute for Security Studies, where I ran the arms management program. And one of our big focal areas at that particular time was implementation support to governments across Africa on firearm regulations, including legislation and policy. And we had a big project working with the Southern African Regional Police Chiefs Cooperation Organization, which is the implementation agency for SADC, around firearms legislation and firearms control. So it's with that particular background that I speak today, but then also have a hat on as an academic to try and understand what has been the impact of these interventions in Southern Africa and a few other places. Also was being involved in the UN negotiations and UN processes around firearms control and working with many governments there. So I've spent a lot of time working with police throughout Africa dealing with issues around firearms control. So really just to start off with, if you can go to the next slide please, Timbani, is there a technical issue? Okay. Just to give you a bit of a time frame here. So prior to 2001, there was nothing in terms of a legal framework governing Southern Africa from a peace and security point of view. But really in 2001, we see something called the SADC Protocol on the Control of Firearms, Ammunition and Other Related Materials that gets drafted and then enters into force in 2004 when a sufficient number of governments actually ratify it. And it's a fairly broad and general and quite technical document. And so what needed to happen in order for it to be a useful document for governments was it needed to be unpacked. So the South African Regional Police Chiefs Cooperation Organization, or SAPCO, which is linked to Interpol, came up with some standard operating procedures. And these standard operating procedures were drafted by the heads of firearm control registries, police legal representatives came up with this particular document. It doesn't have a legal standing, but it's guidelines, and it was quite important in terms of helping governments in Southern Africa to try and harmonize their legislation. Because the challenge in Southern Africa, Timbani, if you can go to the next slide, is that much of the legislation was outdated prior to 2001. Much of it's actually related to colonial times, wasn't really moving in terms of the needs of countries after many of the internal conflicts, civil wars, liberation struggles. It was an attempt to try and find commonality because the issue of firearm violence and trafficking in firearms does not stick within borders. It cuts across. And so what countries were particularly good at doing was joint policing operations, but on the legislative side of things were very different in terms of different penalties, different fines, different limitations on the number of arms, the types of arms that people could have. So the attempt with the SADC Firearms Protocol was to try and find some sort of harmonization. But it's also important to note, you just need to go back, sorry, Timbani. It's also important to note that the contexts in each country in Southern Africa are very different. In South Africa, very high levels of violent crime, as we all know, but in the sort of majority of other Southern African countries, it's a very different state of affairs, particularly low level of firearm violence rates, also low levels of licensed firearm possession. But the concern that came out of all of this was since 2004, there's actually been a very slow track record of legislative reform. Officials, police have been to lots of meetings at the UN level, at the regional level, national level. There have been a lot of efforts in drafting draft documents, but there hasn't been much of progress in terms of converting those draft documents into legislation, and that largely depends on challenges within national parliaments. So police have developed new legislation, but it sort of hits snags when it hits national parliaments, and it's really need to take my hat off to the South African Parliament for prioritizing this sort of legislation. But we have seen some practical progress in places like Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, Namibia and Tanzania. The important thing here is South Africa regionally has sort of been the champion, has been pushing for harmonization, been supporting other governments in their legislative efforts, and really being the regional leader on this. If you can go to the next slide, please. Just to sort of pick up some common trends, and I've got a table on the next slide that will give you a bit more indication. I just looked at a few issues, because firearm legislation, as we all know, it's fairly complicated and it covers a lot of bases. So I've just picked up some common trends. Also in the sense of legislation varies from detail to details, from country to country. So it's really difficult to find information on everything when you look at the legislation, because it's just quite vague in certain countries. But the most common minimum age, for example, is 18, but this does vary, as you'll see in the table. Most countries have background checks of varying degrees of rigor. Countries have regular renewals of firearm licenses as a requirement in law. There are some limitations on the number of firearms. Not all countries have limitations, but many do. It's not necessarily in the legislation, but certainly where we've seen a lot of focus within Southern Africa has been on the policing of firearms and policing operations. Competency testing is practiced in some countries, such as South Africa and Mauritius, and increasingly being considered in places like Namibia and other countries. There has been considerable focus on the marking of firearms and record keeping thereof, particularly of state stockpiles, so that if firearms are used in crime or turn up in police operations, that one can trace it back to a particular source. So there have been international donors that have put money into providing governments with specific types of marking equipment and electronic databases that they can use. Then, of course, there's been a lot of effort in the destruction of obsolete surplus firearms and confiscated firearms. If you can go to the next slide. So this is just a table. It's not comprehensive. It's not all countries. For example, Angola, it's very difficult to find an information about Angola, about the nature of its legislation, and of course there are gaps in this particular table. So for example, countries such as Lesotho and Malawi and others like Swaziland don't necessarily specify in their legislation the amount of firearms that an individual can own. Often this is left up to the discretion of the police or the minister or the chief of the police to make that particular decision. As you can see, the minimum age, it varies. Zimbabwe, which has a fairly old law, is at 14. Swaziland's at 16, 18 for a number of places, and 21 for South Africa and 21 for Lesotho. Renewal process varies from 1 year to no renewals, and it largely depends on the size of the firearm stockpiles in civilian hands, because there are countries with small civilian stockpiles, so doing regular renewals isn't such an administrative burden compared to somewhere like South Africa, where there are millions of firearms that are legally licensed. If you can go to the next slide, please. Oh, just on background checks. So, just varying degrees. They most have a sort of a basic criminal record background check to see if you're of sound mind, sound body, if you're not an alcoholic. But in some places, as we know in South Africa, it's fairly rigorous. In the case of Mauritius, they've also gone a fairly rigorous approach to doing a variety of background checks too. We can just go to the next slide. Just to sort of some interesting innovations that have come out or specific to countries that aren't really practiced anywhere but are interesting, is Botswana has a fairly kind of tight control regime. It only issues maximum of 400 firearm licenses a year. We also need to remember that the Botswana population is quite small. It's less than 1.5 million. And their system is 400 licenses, 200 for shotguns and 200 for hunting rifles. And so you will make a bid or you apply for a firearm license. It goes into a lottery system, and then your name gets drawn out of a lottery system. Handguns are not licensed in Botswana, and they do background checks that include domestic violence focus, which is an increasing consideration in other countries now, but also around hunting offences, because most firearms in Botswana, people seek firearms for hunting, but also protection of livestock. So there's consideration for hunting offences there as well. Then also in Mauritius, they only, in terms of research that I did a few years ago, and according to the police, they only issue about 25 licenses each year. They rarely issue for handguns, and this is predominantly for hunting, and they have very small sort of hunting lodges in Mauritius. So their process around firearms largely is related to the hunting industry, sometimes around private concerns around security, but it's predominantly to do with hunting. Then, of course, it's the academic in me that kind of asks the question, so what? So we have all this legislation in place. We've had lots of talk, but it really doesn't make a difference. You know, we have firearms controls in place ultimately because we want to make, and firearm legislation in place because ultimately we want to make the places we live in safer. So it's really to ask questions about, has this legislation made any difference? And the problem we have in Africa, it's not only a South African problem, is there's very little research that's taken place. So it's difficult to determine whether legislation's made any difference or not, whether it's less rigorous legislation or more legislation that's made any difference, particularly in Southern Africa, which has fairly low levels of firearm homicide anyway, outside of South Africa. And the issue here is, for example, if we look at the United States, a lot of resources was made available to research institutions by government following the assassination of JFK in the 1960s, and that led to a lot of universities and research institutes being able to access funding, foundations being set up to look at both intense regulations that look at restricting access, but also at other types of firearm interventions, such as concealed carry, such as the use of firearms for self-defense. So resources were made available, so we actually have a body of scholarship in the US that gives us a fairly reasonable idea about the nature of controls or the lack thereof. But an interesting thing, and the data, we need to be clear about, the data in Southern Africa is not ideal, but if we look at homicide rates across Southern Africa, with the exception of South Africa, they've remained fairly constant. And this is interesting because despite all the talk, there hasn't been that much change to firearm legislations in other countries. But if we compare those countries to South Africa had a drop in firearm homicide. And why I'm talking about firearm homicide, because it's the most reliable, as those who study crime, it's the most reliable indicator, because other forms of violence largely depend on reporting rates, and we can never clear exactly how reliable those reporting rates are. But in homicide, there's often a body, and there's life insurance, and morgues get involved. But the issue is, there is a difference between reductions in South Africa and in other countries being fairly constant. And the question is, why is this the case? And I want to talk a little bit about studies and what do we know, what we don't know about firearm controls and firearm violence. And I'm sure many of you have seen this data. This is United Nations Office for Drugs and Crime, which is drawing on South African Police Service data, plotting reductions in firearm homicide and homicide in general. And there have been a number of academics and other people with an interest in firearms control or in promoting firearm access who've made a lot of comments about why this has happened. So if we can just go to the next slide. Also in terms of mortuary deaths on the basis of quite, a specific number of cities, I think this is 4 or 5 cities, where we saw a reduction in the percentage of firearms in the commission of homicide, which also is an indication of something has happened around 2000, 2001 that has led to this particular reduction. And what other instruments to being used to commit homicide, such as sharp force such as knives, axes, or blunt force instruments such as clubs, sticks, bricks, have remained relatively constant in certain urban areas. If you can go to the next slide. There's been a lot of conversations about, well, what's happening in South Africa is just a part of a global trend that homicide has been reducing globally in many other countries. But this is not necessarily the case. I've pulled out a few countries here in terms of UN ODC data as well, about some countries have their firearm homicide rates have gone down and some countries they've gone up. So it's very difficult to discern if there's actually been a global drop in homicide. We know if we look at extensive time periods, at everything aggregated, there probably has been. But the sort of work of Manuel Eisner has shown that. But when it comes specifically looking at firearms, there's no clear trend. Sometimes after wars, but if you look at a place like Honduras, where there's been a massive increase, and the same applies to Jamaica and these countries that are not in the state of war. So just to the next one. So it's really around just to kind of frame the conversation about what we know and what we don't know about the impact of firearm control regulations in South Africa. It's around, what difference they've made. And there have been recently a number of, the focus has been on impact. Previously it was very much around the nature of controls. And so researchers and gun control activists looking at what data we have suggested that the firearm homicide rate has dropped due to more rigorous firearms control. Particularly the policy and legislation. The South African Police Service have also made consistent statements about this. But I suppose the question here of putting my academic hat on is, do we have the evidence to support these particular claims? And this has been a kind of a moot point on this. And I think we need a lot more information and studies on this to reach conclusion on it, because either way we don't really have enough information at the moment, but I'll get to that in more detail now. What we've done in recent studies has shown that there is correlation. There's been indications and suggestions of causation, and I think what we've seen in the studies on femicide and reductions in femicide, particularly intimate partner femicide, studies done by the Medical Research Councillors, they've come the closest to causation, and showing that actually certain firearm controls, particularly around domestic violence, have made a difference in terms of reducing femicide. But the issue here is that in terms of we look at victims of firearm violence, firearm homicides within South Africa, is predominantly men. So we do need to be thinking a lot more about this. The problem also we have, and it's a common kind of global problem, is understanding what specific controls. So we've looked generally at the aggregated effect, and it looks like there is a strong correlation between implementing firearm controls in high violence scenarios such as South Africa and reductions in homicide. But we need to try and understand what are the specific mechanisms that are in place. And I just want to highlight a few and look at what data we have out there. Just go back to the first one, please, Timpani. On minimum age, and this is one of the things that changed within the South African legislation of 2004 when it was increasing the minimum age from 16 to 21. And in South Africa, there haven't been resources to actually look at this, and sort of academics were only starting to think about this, is what has been the impact of increasing the age? Are we actually able to determine if this made a difference? Because typically the thinking was if you reduce the age, we know that most perpetrators of firearm violence throughout the world, it's a global trend, are young men. As I said before, most studies are based in the US because that's where the resources have been, and also they have a significant problem with firearm violence in particular cities. And the studies that have been done there, rigorous studies, have shown that minimum age licensing, so increasing or implementing such controls, will reduce access of children and youth to firearms, which will then reduce possible suicides, homicides, and accidental shootings. But unfortunately in South Africa we don't have any studies like this. I'm guessing Professor Sebastian van As will talk about the impact of his work and what his research has shown in terms of reducing children caught in the crossfire. But I'll leave that up to him to present his research. If you can go to the next, I'll keep it on that slide. Also, South Africa introduced competency testing, as we know. This is fairly innovative. Not many countries have it. There's no uniform approach. We know what it's trying to do is bring about more rigorous and more responsible firearm ownership and to try and reduce accidents and accidental shootings. Unfortunately, we don't know much about its impact. It certainly talks to having a positive impact, but at the moment, if we look purely from a research point of view, there isn't much to suggest there. Safe storage, we know we increased the regulations on that in South Africa. Also, US and Canadian studies indicate that safe storage in the home can reduce firearm homicides, suicides, and injuries, just in terms of preventing access. But also in South Africa, we don't know much about the use of SAFE. We just haven't done any studies on this. Background checks, we also know in South Africa and in many other Southern African countries that there's been an increase in the rigor of background checks, a lot more comprehensive. And we unfortunately don't have data on this either in South Africa, but the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which was implemented from 1993 in the US, and it was particularly around background checks in relation to handguns, focusing on criminals, people with kind of mental health conditions, drug addicts, juveniles, etc. And in 2013, and this President Obama made a claim about 1.5 million wrong people had been prevented from acquiring a handgun, and that was fact-checked by the Washington Post, and those figures were confirmed. So it's sort of one of the clearest indications we have that that kind of some sort of background check can make a difference in certain contexts. Then where we've seen a lot of research happening recently, which is quite of interesting, and I think it's really relevant to South Africa, is this issue of policing operations. And within the US, and now in Colombia it's emerging, and also in a number of other South American countries, this focus on what's known as hotspots policing, which is a very technical, scientific approach to policing. You focus on a particular area, you use, they make use of sort of public health language like dosage, where you kind of actually have specific types of patrols, specific types of interventions at specific times, and you actually have researchers who work with the police to study its intervention. So they've done this in a number of US cities, and it's using techniques that the South African police have been using. So if you can just go to the next slide. And this is just really to summarize some of the studies that have been done. So in Kansas City, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, Bogota in Colombia, and Cali in Colombia, we've seen quite significant drops in firearm crime. So this is not just only homicide, but it's firearm crime. And the issue here is very much around if you have a specific type of policing, you can reduce firearm violence in areas that are affected by high levels of firearm violence. And if you can just go to the next slide. Also, we're starting to see research coming out of Brazil, particularly in the case of Sao Paulo, because Sao Paulo in recent times from 2000 saw a massive homicide drop of around 70%. And we have a number of studies which I've just located there. A few of them were PhD theses, which are trying to explain it. And for them, firearm controls are important, but the key issue they put up is the manner in which they're enforced, and it's very much around how the police have tackled it, and the police have made a difference in these respects. But as I say, this is where the research is, and so we know a lot about policing, but we don't know a lot about the other effects at the moment. So in a way, it's like shining a torch down a dark alley. We can get an idea of a certain aspect of firearms control, but we don't really know about the others. Just finally, if you go to the next slide, just so South Africa has invested a lot in policing on this. We know in terms of its flagship operation of Operation Satunya, where a lot of police resources were allocated. We know, plus minus 14,000 firearms were confiscated then, over 1 million rounds of ammunition, thousands of arrests. But this isn't the only operation, but this was a very targeted operation nationwide, and there have been many other focused operations since then. But we've seen some work of sort of Richard Mitsopoulos in the MRC who's suggested in his modeling, his statistical modeling, that policing, particularly before 2004, may be the kind of one of the answers to the question about why we're seeing firearms drop from 2000. If you can just go to the next slide. If we start looking, and this is data that I've used from the South African police, if we try and sort of compare confiscated or surrendered firearms with firearm homicide, but totals of the actual numbers of firearm homicides, we can potentially see a correlation here. We obviously need to explore this, and these are kind of policing operations that have gone into areas of high crime violence, high crime and violence, particularly homicide violence, and engaged in operations to seize firearms in those areas. Just go to the next slide. So just 2 more slides. It's really, in terms of when I look at this issue in South Africa, it's probably a combination effect of controls. It's speculation, but on the basis of what research we have in South Africa and internationally, it probably is a combination, but we need to understand this more. But I think it's an important thing to note. In the Center for Disease Control within the US, there was a comprehensive review of existing studies that have been done on firearms control. And this was looking both at more rigorous control, but also at self-defense type interventions such as concealed carry and others. And they came up with the conclusion that it's insufficient to determine effectiveness means that we do not know, a finding that evidence is insufficient to determine effectiveness means that we do not yet know what effect, if any, the law has on an outcome, not that the law has no effect on the outcome. So the issue here is we need to understand more, we need to explore more, but the general trend is in countries with high levels of violence, that firearms control legislation can have a positive effect in terms of reducing firearm homicide rates. And it's just really, as a final slide, just to kind of suggest and to think about a more targeted evidence-driven approach to reducing firearm violence. And it's about asking questions about where are the greatest concentrations of firearm violence? What are the main drivers of this violence? Who is mainly responsible for this violence? How and where do they acquire their firearms and ammunition? And I suppose a question that flows from that is, if one puts controls in place that affects that particular supply of firearms, where will those individuals go to get other firearms? And then finally, what are the most appropriate responses? So I think these are this is very much me with an academic hat on, saying we know some information, but we need to know more. And I think the plea is that we need urgent, more focused study on these particular aspects to get a much more accurate reflection on it. And the biggest challenge to us in terms of research is, to be critical of the police, is that it's very difficult as researchers to access police data on this particular stuff. I think researchers and members of the public want to understand, but data on firearm violence is just not available to us. And I think that's, an urgent point, that we need to get access to that particular information so that we can start answering some of these questions. Thanks, Aldred. I'd like to leave it at that.
Thank you, Guy. We have a bit of an opportunity to ask questions. The program is structured, though, let me just say this, to take discussions after both papers. What I would like to do, just to give Reniva Fourie a bit of time to come up here, is not to ask Guy questions, but actually to talk to the people around you for 5 minutes while she does that, and actually share what you've heard Guy say. And if you have a question, write down the question now, because you'll have a little bit of time later to ask him that question. But we would like you also to talk to the people around you. So if you know the people on either side of you, maybe turn around and look at the person behind you. Maybe you don't know them. And then have an opportunity to talk to them about what you heard Guy say and how you understood it. Okay, so you got about 5 minutes to do that. Thank you. Good morning once again. You can keep talking for another minute or two, don't worry. Just to let you know that more packs are being printed, so they'll come, and presentations, we'll make sure that you get copies of those. Is that okay? So keep talking for another couple of minutes and then I'll call you to order. Morning. Don't worry, my dear. Thank you. An important institution of state that seeks to foster the kind of policing culture and ethos we want, and that actually looks at not just oversight, but also education, research, and making sure that we can contextualize our police and our policing, and provides the appropriate legislative environment, is the Civilian Secretariat. And the Civilian Secretariat now has a new head, acting head, Reniva Fourie, so she's with us today, welcome. And she'll be talking about this very important institution and its efforts to impact the kind of culture, policing, and society that we want. Welcome, Reniva.
Thank you very much, Aldred. Good morning, honourable members. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I apologise for arriving late. My late arrival and the absence of our political principles is by no means an indication of how seriously we view the summit. In fact, we view it so very seriously that we've been asked by Cabinet to submit a report on today and tomorrow's deliberations. So I also want to thank the Portfolio Committee for initiating it, and then I want to thank all of you for your attendance. When the crime statistics were released in September last year, the stubborn prevalence of violent crime, it was very glaring. And the Minister, I'll just read some of the statistics, that incidence of murder has increased from 16,259 in 2012-2013 to 17,068 in 2013-2014. The murder rate has increased from 45 murders per day to 47 murders per day, and this rate is 5 times higher than the global average. So yes, there's been a reduction, but the reduction is not adequate. In general, there's been a reduction in violent crimes, but in murder in particular, over the past year, it has increased, and it's 5 times higher than the global average of 6 murders per day. So the Minister then called for a national dialogue on crime and violence, and this national dialogue will be taking place on the 16th and the 17th of April. But in the build-up to the national dialogue, we started to have area-specific discussions, and the first one was in February around police conduct, and then today is another one in the sphere of arms. Now, the debate around police conduct was very interesting because we're calling for a demilitarized police service and a human rights-based approach to policing, but that is the one reality, and then it's also juxtaposed against the reality that crime is increasingly violent in nature in South Africa, and the lives of policemen and women are endangered. So likewise, this debate is also very interesting because we have the reality that the levels of violence in society is far too high, and the discussion today is how we're going to be using or how do we exercise better control of firearms in society to reduce the level of violence, and then we juxtapose it against the reality that we have a very well-controlled use of guns in the sporting and hunting arena that contributes significantly to the tourism industry and also to our economy. So the debate is not simple, It's a very complex one, but it's an urgent one because we are seeing that despite the presentation by Guy saying that there has been a reduction in the use of firearm-related deaths, it still is amongst the highest in the world. And a third of all homicides in South Africa are as a result of the use of firearms. According to SAP's figures, illegal possession of firearms and ammunition occurred at a rate of 29.1 per 100,000 people last year. That's the year 2013-2014. This rate has been largely stable over the last 10 years. However, it's still alarmingly high. The Western Cape has the highest rate of illegal possession of firearms and ammunition at 46.7 per 100,000 people, while the Northern Cape has the lowest at 8.1 per 100,000 people. The past 12 years have shown significant changes in the firearms control regime in South Africa, which has impacted on both the use and the distribution of firearms. Furthermore, there has been significant advances in understanding the nature and extent of gun-related deaths through the innovation of a national injury and mortality surveillance survey. Studies show that the number of registered firearms and gun owners decreased from 3.5 million guns amongst 2.4 million owners in 1994 to approximately 3 million guns amongst 1.8 million owners in August 2011. The reduction in gun ownership levels has also been reflected in a massive reduction in the number of gun dealers, a 90% reduction from 2000 to 2006. So while some would regard it as laudable, I think it's also reflecting on the efficiency within the Central Firearms Registry, and that is one of the issues that we must also debate today. So we're saying in those areas where the guns are legal, how effectively and speedily are we able to ensure that those guns are licensed? The Firearms Control Act established a national arms control and management system to regulate the supply, possession, safe storage, transfer and use of firearms and to prevent the criminal or negligent use of weapons. The Firearms Control Act significantly strengthened the regulation over the possession and use of firearms. It introduced a two-tier licensing system. A would-be owner first applies to be declared fit to obtain a firearm license and issued with a competency certificate. Then applies for a firearm license which licenses the person and registers the gun. Whilst the Firearms Control Act has done much to reduce the pool of legal firearms which flowed to the illegal pool, last year's figures show that 5,194 private-owned firearms were stolen and 233 private-owned firearms were lost. Firearms stolen and lost from state officials such as the police, the defense, as well as correctional services also remain too high. 1,769 state-owned firearms were stolen and 199 state-owned firearms were lost in the past year. So we've gotten some resistance to the amendments that we made to the Firearms Control Act, and there will be another opportunity to discuss it in more detail. But I think the figures demonstrate why it is necessary to introduce the concept of biometricing. And I'm intimidated by the Gun Owners Association. It will not look that way. But yes, I'm diverting, and we'll have that discussion at another day. But clearly the figures indicate why, even on legal guns, it was necessary for us to have more stringent measures. The other challenge facing us as a country are the cross-border trade and contraband firearms smuggled into the country. Unfortunately, the complexity of the illegal markets and the dearth in information on these markets and their operations is proving problematic in disrupting the supply of firearms. So what then is the role of civilian oversight in addressing all of these issues? Contributing to the change in the role of social attitude to the possession of and carrying of firearms and towards violent crime in general is important. Included in this are various components of demilitarizing the police. So some of the matters for debate is, should police be allowed to take guns home? Who in the police should be allowed to carry a gun? So the same also then applies to society. Legal firearms entering the illegal pool are in need of stricter regulations, hence the amendments. And this includes the management of state-owned firearms through negligence and corruption, as well as a reconsideration of control over which private citizens have licensed firearms and the number of firearms allowed to private owners. Encouraging amnesties on firearms to reduce the number of legal and illegal guns in circulation, supported by public awareness campaigns targeted by gun law messaging and the health risks associated with poor firearms management is necessary. Amnesties should be followed by destruction of collected guns and ammunition, which in most cases it does happen. Gun amnesties have yielded successful results in Brazil and in the past few years. Supporting the full implementation of the Act and the Central Firearms Registry, for example, sampling and tracking the integrity of the designated firearm officer reports. And we also have a role to play in looking at the gaps, and this will be the policy gaps, and this will be provided in our presentation tomorrow. Another role that we have to play with regards to civilian oversight is providing for regular quality assurance through monitoring and evaluation or research and policy development. The Civilian Secretariat of Police is currently undertaking research on collating and analyzing all firearm-related data from the year 2000, which will help to identify to what extent and how the Firearms Control Registry and the Act has contributed to changing the dynamic environment. The aim of the study is to ensure accurate and accessible data on the supply, possession, safe storage, transfer, and use of firearms. It also aims to explore the number of firearm applications made at police stations per year, per province, to determine the process of destruction of firearms in each province, and to identify aspects of the Firearms Control Act and related mechanisms that have contributed to the reduction in gun deaths and gun-related crime. In respect of civilian oversight, again, we're saying it's important that we develop a comprehensive understanding of the nature of the illegal firearms market. We also need to ensure that there's quality data and access to police data for analysis and efficient management of resources and the interventions. At present, the available data that's linked to legal or illegal firearms is available in a very disparate manner. And so in order to develop an accurate picture, it's important that we collate it and that there's a detailed analysis so that we are able to demonstrate where the linkages exist. One of the things that we also hope to do in the future is to create awareness of judges and magistrates as to who can retain firearms upon conviction of a violent offense. And we're also working on the rapid implementation, or at least Home Affairs is, and the Department of Home Affairs is working on it. And as part of the cluster, we're supporting them in this regard. The rapid implementation of the Border Management Agency to ensure that the movement of cross-border arms is addressed in the immediate term. The National Development Plan recognizes active citizenry and coordinated partnerships as a component to a sustainable strategy for citizen safety. All state parties should work together with non-state bodies, and that's why you are here today, to establish safety needs and to develop strategies to fulfill them. Addressing violent crimes and firearms-related crimes remains a priority for us in the Civilian Secretariat for Police. I thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Fourie. And once again, we apologize for not having all the packs. They are being printed, and also presentations will be made available. Now we have quite a bit of time for discussion and building each other's understanding and insights, and truly getting to understand the impact of not only the two presentations we've heard, but also setting up the discussions to come. So this is an opportunity to prepare us all and really get to know who's in the room and to hear some of those voices. So I invite you to please avail yourself. When you do speak for the first time, please just introduce yourself. I wouldn't want to presume to know everybody. Please.
Thank you. I'm Diane Kohler-Barnard, a member of the committee. To the first presenter, I'm a bit concerned that the research only went up to 2007. Could you explain why that is? I mean, things have changed quite dramatically since, so I find it quite odd that we're basically looking at outdated data. And have you factored in the reference to domestic violence and femicide, the disinclination of many SAP stations to write up domestic violence issues, which means that when it comes to someone applying for a license, they look in the domestic violence register and he is not there, although the wife may have been into the station 5 times having been beaten up. He then takes the firearm and murders her. That is a process. This committee has torn its hair out about the Domestic Violence Act and the seeming inability at many stations to apply it. And we have heard in the last day or so of reports. Now these have been rumors. I've been reported, people have been coming to me for upward of 7-8 years saying there are reports that firearms that were handed in, and it was almost under duress. If one recalls the advertisements and things that went out, it was like, you'll go to jail if you don't hand your firearm in. And widows and people were running in and throwing the firearms at the stations, and many of those, we believed, were being sold on. Well, now we have the proof in Gauteng that robberies that are being done were from firearms that were handed in to Gauteng for destruction. So that is a possible source of many of the firearms on the street, were honest individuals putting them in for destruction. Has that been researched at all? And that question, last question to the Secretariat. We have currently 27,000 at last count, I think it's higher now, SAPS members who don't have the competency certificates, and yet they carry firearms anyway. So basically, if they were to shoot you or me, there would be a big issue in court because they are illegally carrying a firearm. What has the Secretariat done about that? And of course, since 2007, it's well over 15,000 SAPS firearms have been lost, very few recovered, and yet the SAPS simply replaces them. And I did a costing, and we're talking 6 million a shot every year, and it's adding up massively. So basically the SAPS is fueling the illegal firearms trade. And yet, tell me of a single SAPS member who's been dismissed because they lost a firearm. And we've had reports, they leave them in restaurants, in toilets, in all over the place, and nothing happens. And I have asked the Minister, who seems unable to respond, whether there are serial offenders in the SAPS. And they have no idea. It could be the same people every year selling a firearm to supplement their income. Thank you.
Thank you, the Honourable Kohler-Barnard. I've recognized the gentleman over there and the lady here, and we'll come to the Honourable Member, and we'll take those sets of questions, and then you're happy to take it in sets? Okay, because maybe overlapping questions. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. John Welsh, South African Gun Owners Association and the National Collectors Confederation of South Africa. I have an observation to make, first of all, with regards to the first speaker, and then from the Secretariat, and then possibly one or two just questions arising from that. The first one is with regards to Mr. Lamb's acknowledgement that the statistics are not up to date, first of all, and Ms. Kohler-Barnard has emphasized that point, but also that the statistics that are available are not indicative of the true situation currently in South Africa. For instance, to bluntly say that so many homicides occur per day in South Africa is a blunt but wrong statement. First of all, because no distinction is drawn between legitimate killings and illegitimate killings, because there is a major difference. And this, in fact, takes us to the essence of the situation, where a person, in terms of the right of life, in terms of the Constitution, has a right to defend his or her life and other people's lives. Unfortunately, very little or no emphasis is placed on that. In fact, Mr. Lamb has not even referred to that in his analysis of the situation. I believe that matter is clearly lagging. The second issue, with very great respect to the organizers, is that emphasis is placed on firearms control, or as it is generally called, gun control, whereas the emphasis ought to be placed on crime control or people control, because at the end of the day, it is people who commit crimes. It is the attitude of people who have a general attitude of being civilly irresponsible in various ways in life and civilly disobedient to the laws of the country, that things like these take place. It is therefore very unfortunate that not a clearer distinction is drawn in that regard. I would then also like to the reference by Ms. Fourie to, for instance, the number of crimes committed and the illegal possession of firearms. Although, and she is quite correct in what she mentioned, that the Northern Cape, for instance, has got the lowest firearms-related crime rate in the country. Yet, what she has not mentioned, it has the highest homicide rate in the country. At this stage, more people are killed annually in the Northern Cape than anywhere else in the country. What is the reason for that? Sharp instruments mostly are the cause of death to those people. And that indicates one thing, Mr. Chairman, and that is that the complexity of the problem we are talking about. The complexity of the problem indicates that firearms by themselves are not the problem. It is merely an issue in this regard, and I believe that government and the various instruments of government need to look at the real problem rather than merely the symptoms in this regard. So if I could have elaboration as far as that is concerned, there are various other questions that we could raise, but this now is not the time to raise it, because I believe the principles need to be discussed first of all. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Mr. Walsh.
Hello, I'm Adele Kirsten from Gun Free South Africa, and my question is to Guy Lamb. Guy, I'm interested in you suggesting that perhaps one of the additional research questions we need is to look at what particular aspects of the Firearms Control Act were responsible for the firearm homicide, where I think you're positioning that the Act has had an impact on reducing gun deaths in the country. But it's, you know, what particular clauses? Is it increasing the age? Is it the introduction of renewals and competency certificates? And in a way, I'm wondering whether that doesn't take us down a rabbit hole. Does it matter? Because on the other hand, you've also said that it's clear that there, increased police operations like Sotunya, particular hotspot policing, the introduction of stronger gun laws, sort of shifts in gun ownership numbers. So there were a whole number of things that contributed to the reduction. And in a way, is that not enough? So just to grapple with that. But if we, and I mean, I guess this could be an academic question, and if you get the money for it, it might be worthwhile. But if you're going to pursue that particular kind of route of trying to really unpack what aspects of the law made the difference, then one possibility is to use the Zimmering standard. Frank Zimmering is a criminologist who developed a standard called you regulate the type of weapon, you regulate the use of the weapon, and you regulate the user. So it's a very neat kind of formulation, and it's been used in other countries to begin to do sort of comparisons, particularly in Latin America, about what works. So that might be a useful framework to look at what's been effective, and with just your comments on both of those.
Thank you, Ms. Kirstens. I've acknowledged a few folks, so let me just get those hands again. Okay. Can I keep it? Can I ask you just to hold your hands for a second? Okay. I think 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. If we'll allow them to answer these questions and then come to you, otherwise I think 6 more questions is going to overwhelm them a little bit. So please, yes, I'll come to you right after this, ma'am. So that's 7. So if you wouldn't mind, Guy and Ms. Fourie.
Okay, let me try and address all these questions and as briefly as possible to give others an opportunity to ask. The Honourable Colin Barnard, why only up to 2007? I think the point here is we got interesting and fairly detailed data from the Safety and Security Secretariat in 1998, and there was a publication brought out, edited by Robert Chetty from that Secretariat, that gave us really interesting breakdowns of firearm data at that point in time. Then afterwards we didn't see anything. And the firearm data, despite, for example, I did a study for the presidency back in 2008, I think, and the condition that I had on that study was that I needed disaggregated firearm data to do the study, and I was not given that firearm data. So accessing this data became public through the UNODC study, and they put out Excel tables that gave us an indication of the number of firearm homicides and the rate. But it was difficult to verify that information, but we presume it came from the police. Also, the other source of data comes from the Medical Research Council, and they focus on data coming from mortuaries mainly in cities, and due to, I presume, internal decisions and processes, they stopped producing national reports and focused on certain provinces. So I know, for example, in the Western Cape, we have fairly good data that the mortuaries can produce, but certainly we don't have accessible. You can put in a request to the National Injury Mortality Surveillance System that's hosted by the Medical Research Council and UNISA, and they'll make that data available, but it varies in terms of what its coverage is. So, for example, we know in the Western Cape it's fairly good, but some other provinces it isn't. So it's very difficult to get a national picture post-2007. And then it was questions about Domestic Violence Act and the impact of that. Unfortunately, I'm not in a position to answer that question. I think someone like Rachel Jukes and Naima Abrams from the Medical Research Council and Shanaz Matthews from the Children's Institute at UCT are in better positions to answer those particular questions because they're the ones who've done the research and published the studies. And the interesting thing that comes out of that was particularly around reductions in individuals in the private security industry or police who had firearms, and the kind of declarations, particularly around the private security industry, of individuals not having access to firearms anymore that seem to have had an effect. But I can't speak on their behalf, unfortunately. Then this issue around firearms that are supposedly destroyed and then find their way back into the hands of criminals who then use them. Obviously this is a huge concern, and I certainly haven't seen any studies other than media analysis. We know it's happened in a certain number of police stations, and it seems from the SAP's response that they're trying to deal with it. There was one particular case in KwaMashu which was particularly concerning given the nature of violence in that area, and I think it's certainly something that needs to be addressed, and it's about corruption of these specific stations and management of these specific stations that needs to be addressed. In response to Mr. Welsh from Saga, about legitimate killings, I didn't talk about the issue of the use of firearms to prevent violence or shooting in self-defense, because we just don't have any good studies on this. There have been some surveys that were put out in South Africa, but in the terms of fairly strong rigor, there's nothing that's been published in reputable journals on this, so it's very difficult to draw conclusions on the basis of that. The key study that's quoted regularly is a study by John Lott in the US, who brought out a book called More Guns, Less Crime. But what subsequently happened with that study was other academics started to ask John Lott for his data. And when he started to come up with excuses that the data was lost, he couldn't mention the research assistants that had been on the study, and it actually led to the editor of Science Journal, which is the top academic journal probably in the world, to accuse John Lott of research fraud. So the problem with that study is it's been widely quoted, but we don't actually know if it's useful or not because he hasn't been able to produce his data. So that does, from a point of view, it's just very difficult to make a statement on that. There have been other studies in the US, but as I said, there's been these Campbell reviews that have taken place, these kind of assessments of the nature of research, and it's really difficult to tell in terms of what context they work, what they don't work. I mean, certainly in South Africa, we've got anecdotal evidence to show that in some cases, owning a firearm, producing a firearm, brandishing a firearm can produce injury or death, but then it could potentially have a knock-on effect and make others more vulnerable. We're at a situation where we actually don't really know what the impact of that is if we're going to speak it from a purely kind of scientific point of view here. Then this issue of people who commit, it's people who commit crime, not guns. I mean, fair comment, but the issue is what we do know about firearms and the sort of models that are out there, and we're looking at quite sophisticated statistical models and trying to understand violence against women and children and the perpetration thereof. And the one thing we do notice in these models is if there's an availability of firearms, it changes the equation in specific areas. It makes the potential for lethal violence much, much higher. The risk of violence is much higher in those particular contexts. So it's around firearms are not neutral objects. They have an increased lethality. So I think it's not something we can't just treat them as that. It's about we need to look at people, but we also need to look at the firearms. So that was the kind of comment that Adele made from Gun Free about needing to think about not only the firearm, but also the controls around it and the people around it. And you kind of, Adele, you raised these questions about, does it matter to have a kind of a zoned-in focus? And my argument is, in contexts of high violence, we do need a fairly rigorous framework. And I think that's what the studies within Brazil are starting to show us because they have better data than we have. And they can actually they've got longitudinal studies they can look at and the effect of, following a population of people and see what impact, controls have had in certain communities. But I think it's also quite useful to know what we're doing well and what we're not doing well. And I think it's around here is, should we be devoting a lot of resource to something that actually has a marginal effect, for example. I didn't put it in my presentation, but I mean, if one sort of looks at the police data around firearm losses, like total firearm losses and thefts, and kind of compares that to firearm homicides, they actually do mirror each other. So when the firearm losses went up, the firearm homicide went up, and when the firearm losses came down, the firearm homicide numbers came down. So there is some suggestions around one needs to also understand what controls are in place, prevent firearms from being lost or stolen, which ones will encourage more responsible firearm use, I think, and we don't know enough about that. So my argument would be we need the framework, but we also need to understand what's working, what's not working in that. And we'll never get kind of conclusive answers. It's just the nature of the game. But I think it is about understanding where the strengths and weaknesses are too. Thank you.
I'll begin with Ms. Barnard's question with regards to the loss of firearms within SAPS and whether they are serial offenders. So I won't respond to the question directly, but I'll say that from our side we've had 2 interventions that hopefully will assist The first is within the amendments to the Firearms Control Act. We're tightening the accountability mechanisms and the disciplinary mechanisms that applies to police persons who misplace or lose their firearms. And then secondly, we're introducing the ballistic sampling, which we're saying must start with SAPs, and the biometric marking, so that if a firearm is lost and it is recovered, we are able to better hold that person accountable. Then the second intervention, last week Friday, the Deputy Minister had engaged SAPS, and General Sitole was amongst the people, and she also once again went to the Firearms Registry. Now, there were 2 studies that were conducted prior to my time, and we've received the outcomes of those studies. We've analyzed the studies, and then in addition to the Deputy Minister's visit, SAPS has designed a turnaround strategy specifically for the Firearms Control Registry, but also she's engaged them on the management of arms within SAPS, including the competency testing and the losses thereof. So they've been asked to come up to present to the Deputy Minister which management control mechanisms that they are going to be putting in place. And she's given them a deadline of a month. So we're waiting for that report, and then we'll present that report to the Portfolio Committee. Then with regards to Mr. Walsh's comment, I want to thank you for bringing the debate of the legitimate and illegitimate use of guns and deaths, and deaths that are resulting from self-defense. And I think that you are quite correct if you say that there are multiple variables that contribute to violence in society, and that gun control is just one aspect thereof. And it is a reality that sharp objects are significantly linked to homicides, not just in the Northern Cape, but in the country as a whole. However, it doesn't negate the need for us to have a discussion on arms. And that is what this platform is about today and tomorrow. So we're saying, yes, there are there's a multiplicity of variables, and all of those variables must be discussed. As I had indicated in February, we had this discussion on police conduct and the violence of police versus the violence that the police are confronted with and how it should be managed. And in April, we're going to have an elevated debate that is going to be discussing all the aspects, or we're going to try and ensure that there's a discussion on all the aspects. So you'll be invited again. What we are asking for and what we're hoping for is that both sides, Adele and yourself, that at least that we use this platform to get both sides' views and to get an amicable solution that we can capture in a policy intervention to make South Africa a more safe and less violent country.
I've acknowledged 8 hands, and I've seen your hand. You're up next. I'm going to go to the Honourable Member of the Chair. We're going to go 1, 2, and then the gentleman over there. So we'll take those 4, and then we'll go 1, 2, 3, Mr. Makana. That's the next 4. And then the gentleman here, that's 4. So we'll do it 5, and that's it. Okay, so we're going to take 4 and then 5. Is that okay? Okay, thank you, the Honourable.
Thank you, Chairperson. My first question is to... Oh, my name is Angie Muliwat. I'm a member of this Portfolio Committee. My first question goes to Mr. Lamb. You spoke of a decline in homicide, and you attributed that to good legislation and tougher control. But there is still homicide. Now, in your view, what can be done to increase this decline? My second question is, tell us more about this lottery system used in Botswana. My next one is on, you kept on mentioning background checks. In your view, is this background checks sufficiently done, or what do you suggest? Thanks, Chair.
Please. Thank you.
Morning, my name is Martin Hood. I represent the security industry. I've been involved in the Firearms Control Act since its inception. There's a few familiar faces here. Nice to see you all. To the new chairperson of the Portfolio Committee, thank you very much for inviting us over here. We felt at one stage that we had been forgotten, but that's been rectified. Thank you very much. I want to make a couple of statements just to contextualize where we are, because I already see some trends coming out of this very short part of the process. The first one is very simply from Guy's presentation, and I never thought I would agree with Guy, Adele, and the Secretariat in one go. So this is quite an occasion. Guy's point, I think, is that with better policing you have lower levels of crime. That's a basic fundamental, and I think that that is something that we should bear in mind throughout this debate, and that is basic policing, basic enforcement of laws. Before you go and start building other structures when your existing laws may not necessarily work or be properly implemented. I then also just want to comment on the commonality that I see between my personal beliefs and those of Gun Free South Africa and the Secretariat, and that is license the person. I heard the Secretary mention license the person, and it's a policy that I and certainly all of the other firearm organizations here would wholeheartedly endorse. License the person, register the gun. Then I want to just make a comment about the amendments. They've come up several times, and I know that here is not the time or place to debate the amendments, but I want to give the people present a sense of how I see these amendments. And I'm going to give one example because I think it will set the tone when we come to debate the amendments. There are some good things in the amendments. There's some very bad things, but we'll deal with those. But the Secretary has mentioned greater discipline over the South African police when it comes to their firearms. I've got a fundamental problem with that, and I think this goes to the very root of what we're going to discuss. Because in the suggested amendments, a police officer is only going to be subjected to an internal inquiry if he loses his firearm, whereas the rest of us face up to 5 years in jail if we lose a firearm and are convicted of the offense of losing a firearm. So I would suggest that you must put police officers on par with us, or us on par with police officers at the very least, because they're the enforcers of the legislation. The last point, and going back to Guy's presentation, is quite simply I wholeheartedly agree there's not a great deal of data that is either scientific or unbiased, so we need to do more research. And if we look at the Firearms Control Act, and I think this is something for the Portfolio Committee to consider very carefully, there are a number of mechanisms in the Firearms Control Act that obligate the police to report on their activities by way of submission of annual reports. And I'm not aware if any of those annual reports have been submitted at all, or if they've been submitted on a regular basis. So let's get the fundamentals of the legislation addressed first, before we start going and building more towers without proper foundations.
Thank you, Mr. Hood. I'm sure you'll find broad consensus and agreement emerging already. So I have acknowledged, please.
I am Peter Groenewald. I'm a member of the Portfolio Committee. Thank you, Chair. I think I just want to say to Mr. Hood, maybe we should put the police on par with the public. It will be to the benefit. What I want to say, firstly, on an opening remark, is I think we must say to each other, we must remember that guns don't kill people. Because if we say that guns kill people, we say pencils misspell words. We must remember that. And my question is actually to Mr. Lamb, and I always say when you deal with statistics, you must be very careful. Because, you know, according to statistics, they can say that 95% of people die in a bed. So I can say a bed is a very dangerous object. Please stay away from the bed. And my question on him, or to him, is on the statistics when it comes to homicide. Now, firstly, there are various state departments who deal with firearms. The police, the defense force, correctional services, municipal police, all those departments. Do you have a distinction between the statistics from homicides in state departments and the public? Because when we have to deal with legislation in Parliament, the main object is actually the public. And we must get a broader and a better picture when we deal with this. And I'd like to know whether we have those statistics. Thanks.
Thanks, Jan Groenewald. I acknowledge the gentleman sitting next to Mr. Walsh. So we'll take those 4, and then we'll do the next 4. Yes, I've acknowledged him. Thank you.
My name is Clem Daniel. I'm a special advisor to the South African Gun Owners Association. Really just a few observations. Mr. Lamb, I think you're 100% correct that we need to take an evidence and data-driven approach. I also believe it's quite dangerous to extrapolate information from US studies to the South African environment. We are very different societies with very different issues that we are trying to grapple with. One of the things that has concerned me, and one of the gaping holes in the data, is that we have no studies. I could not find a single study done on the self-defense uses of firearms in South Africa. Yet we have a Section 13 that permits licensing in that context. We need to understand to what extent these firearms are successfully used in self-defenses or not, and to balance that against the overall issues that we need to consider. We also need to get a better idea of the sources of illegal firearms. I have seen studies, and I have read a number of your studies as well, and I've seen indications and estimates of anything between 500,000 and 6 million, depending upon who is doing the estimating. I looked at your study under the gun, and looked at the net civilian losses, after what had been recovered from the police. And using a sort of back of the cigarette butt calculation, it seemed to me that it would take anything between 150 and 1,000 years for civilian losses to make up the total number of estimated illegal firearms. In which case we have a much bigger problem than simply civilian losses, and we need to understand that in order to be able to tackle it, bearing in mind that we also live in a country with very porous borders. The other factor is, of course, that many people are under the impression that firearms are difficult to manufacture. It's not necessarily true. We know from some police reports that have appeared in the media that problems are being experienced with firearms being manufactured in the Western Cape now illegally. So there are really, I think, a number of things we need to do. One is we need to consider the competency processes and whether those are being adequately implemented, and whether we're sorting out the wheat from the chaff. We as gun owners are anecdotally aware of the fact that in many instances the background checks are not being properly done or not being done at all. It's a significant concern to us. We are totally opposed to illegal firearm ownership, and we are totally opposed to a system where background checks are not adequately done and people who should not have firearms become possessed of those. That's a significant concern to us. The only other point that I think is perhaps worth making is that it's not so much the number of firearms as who is in possession of them, which ties back to the competency issue. And finally, we need to bear in mind that, as the Secretary indicated, firearms are only a part of the problem. According to the Statistics South Africa data, for the last 10 years at least, for every assault-related death that occurs with a firearm, more than 50 people have been murdered with sharp objects. And so we have less of a firearm crisis than a social crisis, quite frankly, although firearms are part of it, and we obviously do need an appropriate framework. Thank you very much.
Can I thank the 4 contributors thus far? We've got 5 more people I've acknowledged. We have half an hour for the 5 people. So just give me a second. I'll give the two speakers an opportunity to respond, and then we'll take the 5 hands I've already acknowledged, starting with you, sir. Right, thank you.
Let me go first again. The first question from the honourable member. What do we do to increase the decline? And I think that's what I was trying to get at the end of my presentation, was about asking specific questions. And I think maybe to be a bit more detailed, it's about to look at those particular places which have very high levels of firearm violence. And if we're going to do something immediate in the short to medium term, I think there's issues around and these comments about social drivers of crime, and yes, we have some understandings of that. That's going to take decades to deal with, and there are actually other government departments that need to be kicking in to deal with those particular aspects. But on the issue of short to medium term would be focus on the areas which have the highest level of firearm violence, and I think the police do know what the hotspots policing precincts are, have focused policing operations looking at collecting and confiscating illegal firearms in those particular areas, and you would probably see a net result from that if you wanted fairly quick gains. And I think that's been happening in many respects, but I think it goes back to Satunya and operations before that and afterwards had an impact. We just haven't been able to study the outcomes in a kind of an ineffective way. On the lottery system, and this is the one, and it's fairly unique to Botswana, is, I mean, I understand every year those who want to apply for a firearm license apply for one. This includes government officials, even police. If you want a personal firearm in the Botswana police, you have to apply for a license in the lottery system. You put your application in, they draw out 200 for hunting rifles, 200 for shotguns, and then they do a background check on you. And if you don't qualify, then you don't get your license. So, you know, there's kind of these kind of checks that go into place. So it's that's the system they've been using. It's very difficult to determine what impact it's had, but it seems to work for Botswana. There's been no, I mean, I know the hunting industry has raised concerns about it because it does affect tourism, but I think some arrangements are made when the need arises. Then background checks, are they significantly done? I mean, I think the question has been answered here. I mean, South Africa has probably some of the most rigorous requirements in terms of background checks if we were to follow the letter of the law and the regulations about interviews, assessments, because most countries would really just do a kind of criminal background check and find out, you know, do you have a criminal record, or were you admitted to a psychiatric hospital at some point, where the South African police are supposed to do a round of interviews, which is a time-consuming process, but I think when effectively done, and the point has been raised, can really make a major difference in terms of making sure that individuals who shouldn't have firearms don't get them. And just on some kind of anecdotal remarks that have come out of some studies around youth violence and gangs that I've been involved in, where, you know, youngsters on the low down on the criminal food chain have sort of indicated that they don't use guns because they can't get guns. It's more difficult to get access to illegal guns these days than it was 10 years ago, for example. But very difficult. And this comes to this kind of question about understanding the nature of, we need to be able to understand the nature of the illegal firearm economy. And we don't really understand it. We have kind of estimates. I mean, the police estimates in the sort of late 1990s there was around 500,000 firearms out there. We do know at one particular point in time that there were more than 20,000 firearms that were being lost or stolen each year. Those numbers have come down in recent years, but we really don't have a particularly clear picture of how the illegal economy works, how gangsters and criminal groups that are involved in home invasions, how they actually acquire their firearms. I think police probably have some intelligence on this because they would recover weapons that have been involved in the commission of crime. Sometimes they have serial numbers on, sometimes they don't. But the one thing we do, the dynamic that we know is most interpersonal violence, so not violence that relates to robbing of banks or acid in transit vehicles. So most kind of where people are murdered on the street or in their homes is largely handguns. And the question is, where do those handguns come from? Initially there was speculation in sort of the 90s that they were coming across the borders, but from what could be, you know, reflection on that, most of the guns that were coming from or available in Mozambique and Angola, where civil wars had been taking place, were actually automatic rifles. And the evidence that was produced in the late 90s was predominantly handguns. So the issue here is we do really need to get a good understanding of which guns are used in crime, and if possible, where do these guns come from? And I think that's a key question to be answered. What else do we have here? Let me leave it at that.
I asked Guy to go first because I agree with all the comments. And I think we're moving closer to getting consensus. The first one that I agree with is that we do have a social crisis. Besides the criminals and gangsters, I think many people in South Africa are just a bit too violent. If we look at the protest, it's fine for people to protest, but they go the extra mile and they destroy things and they even injure other people. If we look at the high levels of domestic violence, if we look at the high levels of child abuse, we're supposed to be nurturing our future, but instead there are some people who prefer to destroy our children instead of protecting them and building them. So yes, there's a social crisis, and that crisis must be acknowledged and it must be confronted. And we need all organs of civil society and state to see how we're going to overcome it. And in that regard, there'll be another opportunity for debate. There's the white paper on safety and security that begins to provide a framework for debate. And then the second thing that I agree with is that to a large degree, the Firearms Control Act was good, and from our opinion, from our side, we obviously think that now it's even a bit better. But the statement that we need to get the fundamentals in place in terms of compliance with the Act is a very valid statement. And in that regard too, we're talking, when we look at the issuing of the competency certificates and how that process is undertaken and that it needs to be tightened up, I think that element is noted. Then the last one is on the issue of data. And as a Secretariat, we acknowledge that there is a data gap, both with regards to the collation of the data and the quality of the data. So as I had indicated earlier when I did my remarks, the Civilian Secretariat is currently doing research on collating and analyzing all firearms-related data since the year 2000, including death and injury. That will and one of the things that we're going to, one of the objectives of the study is to ensure accurate and accessible data on the supply, possession, safe storage, transfer, and use of firearms. This will include the process of destruction of firearms and the gaps in this regard, including the sale of guns that were supposed to be destroyed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I've kind of tried to keep track of whether questions have been asked or whether they're simply statements, and I think they're doing a fairly good job. So let me take the 5 hands that I've acknowledged. You were not involved, General Sele, but let me get the 5 first, and if it's 6, then we'll fit it in. So please, next to Kolobana, speak to the gentleman at the back, then the gentleman here, and the lady, amongst others. And then the Honorable Ramatakana. Okay? And you're the last one, 6. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Please.
Thanks very much. The name is Akele Mbele, a member of the Portfolio Committee. My first question springboards from a point in Mr. Lamb's presentation about the impact of targeted policing interventions. And it springboards into a question directed at Ms. Fourie. I was struck by the statistic she mentioned of the Western Cape having the highest rates of illegal firearm possession. Excuse me. But now I imagine that's the kind of statistic that is reliant on or indicative of police work that detects and sort of makes that into data that is then reported on, in the same way that, for example, an increase in the reporting of domestic violence could indicate the effectiveness of awareness interventions, not necessarily more domestic violence. And so my question is, in terms of the information you have on that, are those high rates of illegal firearm possession that are detected the results of higher rates of police operations, whether it's Metro Police or joint SAPS and Cape Town Metro Police, because I am aware there's quite a concerted drive in the Metro around those sorts of things. And in particular, this then hooks onto another point that Mr. Lamb made, that I recall he said that, sorry, let me just find the point here. Oh, he said the availability of firearms in certain contexts just does change the homicide equation. It was the whole availability of firearms versus the control of them. So if there is that correlation between firearm, so if the context matters and the Western Cape was flagged as the highest, I would imagine that's gang related. Do you have data to back that up? And if that were the case, that these illegal firearm possession rates are the highest and they're linked to gang violence, would that not be a strong basis on which to motivate for a specialized gang unit in the Western Cape? Because the data is quite clear about how those policing interventions, which seem to have some impacts, can then result in something concrete to then actually start addressing that issue. And then my second question, it just reinforces the point that was made by Advocate Hood about the need to address the fundamentals. Ms. Fourie mentioned that the Deputy Minister has asked for plans and measures to improve the operational effectiveness of the Central Firearm Registry. And when the committee did our oversight visits to Pretoria in September, as I recall, we were promised that a turnaround strategy is in the pipeline or is just about to be implemented. But what's not clear is that there's a sufficiently clear eye on ensuring that the basics are in place and being implemented. I mean, the committee will remember what we saw: records that are piled up along the corridor because there's no storage space. The building itself is defective, with wind blowing in during winter, and we all know how, or some of us will know how those Pretoria winters can get, to the extent that pigeon excrement that is on the windowsill seeps in, and so resulting in bird lice, and some staff members at the CFR have actually taken off sick because of those conditions. So there's a great concern that with that situation, I mean, it's a complete fire hazard, and the way the papers are stored means that wood lice and rats have also become a problem. Those were the concerns we had expressed to us by the staff members there. So I'm very concerned that these basics and these operational fundamentals, there's not yet a strong enough grip on them to ensure that we're at least optimally performing within the regime that's in place now, as opposed to getting distracted with red herrings of things that in the end might not be implemented anyway. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Program Director. I am Patrick Mongwe, and I'm the chairperson of the Firearms Appeal Board. My first question will be directed to Mr. Lamb. From the studies which you have revealed before us today, particularly the issue of SADC countries in comparison, it is clear that from what we have seen, it appears that South Africa as a country appears to be the one which it's experiencing a high volume of firearm possession, there be it legal or illegal. My question is it not an issue perhaps of that we have got a culture or a cultural problem as South Africans of the love of guns? Because I can say not very long ago, there was a culture whereby people used to walk carrying spears and knobkerries in the name of culture also. But that culture, if you walk today down Long Street, you don't meet people carrying spears and knobkerries, because that culture has been discouraged. Now, what has replaced that culture of the love of the weapons, of spears and knobkerries? I've got no doubt that owning of firearms by a majority of us has become the norm. Therefore, if it's a cultural issue in comparison to other SADC countries, what is your thinking, Mr. Lamb, that is it not also an option to look at to whether is this culture sustainable? Does it need to be encouraged and perpetuated? Or must we educate each other as South Africans to limit this love of guns? Now, you have revealed to us that other countries, the maximum limits of firearms is around about between 2, others 1 and 4. My question is, I wonder if you are aware what is the limitation of ownership of firearms per individual in our country compared to SADC countries. Perhaps it will be revealed when the SAPS present, or perhaps any other association which utilize firearms. But I've got no doubt that in certain categories of our citizens, there's no such thing as a limit. If you achieve a certain particular status, you can amass as many firearms as you like, because you belong to a certain category of individuals based on associations and accreditations of you as an individual. Therefore, I'm saying this issue of limitation also does not fall very far from the issue of culture of the love of firearms by us South Africans. But the question is, what is the good out of it? Now, the last one, which perhaps the Secretariat will pay much more attention. We have spoken about the background checks, and we hail it as one of the mechanisms which is not utilized in other SADC countries or in other countries worldwide. And this assists in sieving what we deem as people who are not fit to be issued with firearms. I also agree, partly, that it is a good system and it is helpful. But I'm saying that it is also defeated. That purpose is also defeated by the provision of the very same act which many of us glorify as one of the best things we have created to control firearms. For an example, the SAPS members might have done a background check, and the neighbors, the spouses, colleagues have shown that this individual is violent in nature. Therefore, they do not recommend that he or she have a firearm license. But the Act comes and provides somewhere and say further that if you have been convicted of a violent offense, such as domestic violence, assault, etc., you may not have a competence certificate. That is a good provision of a section. But within the very same Act, lastly, Chair, it further says, if you have been convicted of a violent offense, but you have paid an option of a fine, you therefore qualify for firearm. It further provides that if you are convicted as a murderer or a violent or a domestic violent person and having been declared unfit to acquire a firearm licenses. After 5 years, you qualify. So how does it assist this act? I think the honestly consideration of the whole act is necessary. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we're getting to the point where we're going to have to ask each other to make the question, and we'll get the supporting statement after the fact. Is that okay? We have 4 more people who wish us to speak, and then we'll end by them trying to give a response. Can we just ask the question, please? Thank you. Otherwise, I'll take my liberties as the chair.
No, thank you very much, Chairperson. Well, my name is Leonard Ramatlakana. I'm a member of this committee, Portfolio Committee. Now that you have intervened...
belatedly, I believe, so my apologies.
let me try to go straight to the question. I just want to ask Mr. Lamb, this issue about data, evidence-based, lack thereof, and inability, therefore, to answer the question conclusively in terms of what is to be done. Why is it so? Is it a problem of the capacity in terms of basically collaboration capacity? Because certainly there's been lots of work that the police have been doing in understanding the trends and the type, including the weapon that is used for commission of a crime? Or is it the issue about the trust or issues about vetting? So what is it that basically becomes a barrier to this kind of information? Because as we're making the laws and you tell us that you have a gap of understanding this particular question, and we would have to make the law as we see it. The second question is the issue that was being raised around the prevention, the issue of prevention. Perhaps the issue of prevention, if you could deal with it, but I just wanted to ask a question. Beside the prevention, do you have any study of comprehensive evidence-based study in respect of minimizing or neutralizing the issue of crime, including homicide? I mean, you may have saw the slide about Bogota and America. I mean, some of the things they did in Bogota in terms of dealing with it's been completely different. So I just want to understand in terms of our context here, because the issue about the environment aspect of it is this whole package of dealing with the complex, not only the one aspect of it. If you have such a study that perhaps you could share with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairperson. My name is Pindile Mola, a member of this committee. My question goes to Mrs. Fori, who must ensure that all firearms submitted in an amnesty are safe.
Thank you. The women are setting the trend and showing us by example. Thanks very much.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. Unfortunately, I don't think I'm going to be able to follow the honourable member behind me, because that was laudably brief. My question, my name is Paul Oxley. I'm from the Sports Shooters Forum. My problem is actually, and I'm quite glad to see that Mr. Lamb brought up some of the graphics that he did. It's something that's been troubling me for many years, and I'm glad that he brought it up today so that I can actually hopefully drill down and get an answer. I don't know if anybody else noticed, but the slope of downward, the rate of decrease in firearm homicides on the graphic that he displayed indicates a steady downward slope from about the beginning of the graph, about 1994, onwards right through to almost present. And one of the major effects on that graphic was actually where the rate of decrease slowed down. Now, the honourable member behind me has talked about how we can talk about increasing the decline, the rate of decline. And we actually slowed the rate of decline down in approximately 2004, 2005. Now, 2004, 2005 is significant because that's the date that the Firearms Control Act began to be implemented. So it seems to indicate that the Firearms Control Act actually inhibited the decrease or the rate of decline in firearm-related homicides. The rate then picks up again slightly and the rate of decrease starts to increase again in approximately 2009. And if you study with the recent developments in firearm licensing, you'll find that from about 2009, 2010, the process of licensing civilian firearms, private firearms, picked up. It increased. A lot of the problems that were being experienced with processing firearm licenses were cleared out of the way at approximately that time. So it seems to indicate to me, and I hate to be the one to raise this because, but it seems to me very much to indicate that the much discredited John Lott study seems to be closer to the mark in South Africa by our own experience than what we perhaps like to acknowledge. And I'd like, if there's an explanation for this, showing the contrary, I'd really appreciate it. My next question also relates to issues which have been brought to the table today, to the chamber today, relating to the intimate femicide studies. And the original intimate femicide study that was produced had the data sets attached to it which were quite revealing. The update on that, they removed the data sets. So you can't actually see where they're getting the information from, but the update merely reiterates certain points from the original study. And what the original study shows, which is quite fascinating, is that in those communities where access to firearms was easier, or where there was easier access to firearms, that also correlates quite strongly with the lowest incidence of intimate femicide. And conversely, in those areas where firearm access was more restrictive, it seems to indicate that the rate of intimate femicide increases. Now that I don't know what I'm not a statistician, I don't draw inferences from that, but it seems to indicate to me that again, we're looking at the wrong end of the problem. I'd like Mr. Lamb particularly's comment on those because that fascinates me. And we must, I think as per the other honourable member mentioned, that correlation is dangerous. We must be beware of taking correlation as equaling causation. It certainly isn't. We have to be very careful of that in everything we do. So that's just dealing with the data that we already have. Yes, there's much more data that we need, but on the data sets that we already have, we seem to be interpreting it curiously.
Or differently.
Differently, yes.
Okay.
Thank you.
Remember, we have two panels that is significant also in terms of responding to the kinds of questions that's already been asked. So I want the panelists on those panels to please also, we may just talk to you over tea, to think about how do you incorporate some of the questions that has been asked and some of the things that's already been said in your response as panelists. Is that okay? So that we don't put all the burden on these two to respond. So we'll ask them to make some closing remarks, and I will also see if there's questions that I've jotted down that are best covered under the two panels yet to come. Is that okay? So thank you very much. Can we ask them to do some closing remarks? General, I have not acknowledged you at this point, but we'll make sure we give you a platform to contribute. Thank you.
Okay, remain with the process. Let me try and answer some of these questions. I mean, the first question that was specifically to me from the gentleman from the Firearm Appeals Board, that's a question that can keep us busy for all day, many, many days about culture. I think kind of a short answer to questions within South Africa, we see probably culture is a loaded term, but maybe kind of micro-cultures in relation to firearms, because we have sports shooters communities, we have hunters communities, we have collectors, we have enthusiasts. Certainly we've seen probably changes in behavior in terms of people carry weapons, where they carry weapons. I think the law has restricted that kind of type of behavior, that type of how weapons are used and carried. Certainly that's what it's promoted. I think this issue around within South Africa, we have a culture of violence problem that cuts across races and cuts across age groups as well. And it's the manner in which, as South Africans, and this is speaking in very arrogant terms, resolve conflict. And it's the use of violence in that particular conflict, I think, is quite important. And we need to look for techniques to do that. And when one has a gun in the equation, it just increases the risk of lethality quite significantly. But it's complex, and we need to try and understand it more effectively. Just to give you an anecdotal reference here, we just did a study last year, and it was an ethnographic study on the youth gang phenomenon in Khayelitsha, which is very different to the gangs of Manenberg and Hanover Park, the traditional kind of Cape Coloured gangs. This is of young boys, essentially, who are engaging in armed conflict with one another in a battle type of sense, where they go at each other with pangas and golf clubs and knives and axes. And it's two types of gangs, the Vuras and the Vatos. And the research, the ethnographic research that was done and asked gangsters, why no firearms? The first question was, well, we actually like to get close. The firearms creates distance, we want to get close, and this is part of, the nature of this particular violence. So, I mean, it's very isolated, but I think we don't really have a particularly good understanding of the nature of the culture of violence on these particular aspects. I think Kapana Ratela from the Medical Research Council has done some really good work on masculinity within South Africa, and it's the understanding of masculinity, I think, where this comes from. Particularly also studies on violence against women and children has sort of come up with some fairly good analysis of, why it is that men perpetrate violence against women and children. Then it's the question of data and access to data. And I know it's quite refreshing to hear that things have changed, and they have been changing recently. But previously, some years ago, the previous management of the Central Firearm Registry was not willing to part with any data. And I think it was sort of concerns around security, concerns around maybe the accuracy, concerns that they'd be criticized. There were court cases happening right up at the Constitutional Court level, so I'm just speculating, but certainly they were not parting with the data under any circumstances. And I think we're probably at a much weaker point now because that data wasn't released, that we don't understand as we should understand. So I think it's certainly a welcome trend that the Secretariat and the police are being much more open in terms of sharing of that information. Then it was then Paul, your question about the data and the trends. And the murder rate, certainly if we look at the murder rate, that did come down. The problem is we don't really have particularly reliable data from 94, but it was the firearm homicides that peak in 98 and then start to decline there, then slow down. I don't think we understand enough of that decline, but what we do know of a lot that was done, and it's sort of current research that I'm doing, and I think some of the answer lies within the policing thereof in terms of that dramatic decline, in terms of soaking up of firearms in specific areas where there were high levels of violence. So I think that the thing here is if we want to understand what effects policing, the law, self-defense has had, we've got to look at areas where the highest levels of violence is happening. So we just don't know enough about that. In places like in Younger, for example, we don't. It would be useful to ask a question in Younger. To what extent has the use of a firearm prevented yourself from getting injured? Because there are, more than 300 homicides a year in a place like in Younger, compared to someone like Claremont, which is only a few. So I think it's really about the micro studies and the context. And the same applies to the study that Rachel Dukes, Nima Abrams, and Shanaz Matthews have done on femicides and firearms. I think when we look at things in an aggregate way, sometimes we lose the detail. And it's about, I think, trying to understand the context in which this violence is happening, because there was questions and comments made about domestic violence registers and police not taking action. I think it's very much, it varies from context to context, and some police stations are better than others. And we know that from the Commission of Inquiry into Khayelitsha that there were some serious problems in Khayelitsha about general police response to crime versus somewhere like Claremont, for example, or Mowbray, where you've got, far more kind of responsive police. So I think it's about needing to drill down, the sort of point at you, to get a much better understanding. And I think that's what I would like to encourage. Thank you.
Some closing remarks.
Okay, thank you. Yes, I'll respond to Mr. de Klerk's statement of closing remarks, particularly because, as he had indicated, some of the issues will be addressed by the other panelists. And the South African Police Service will tomorrow speak to the implementation of the turnaround strategy or the implementation of the Act, and then they'll also respond to the question of whose responsibility is it to keep the guns that were meant for destruction safe, and what mechanisms are there in that regard. Then, in respect of the gang data and the interventions by SAPS with regards to the management and control of firearms amongst gangs, yes, the South African Police Service will respond to it, but also the Civilian Secretariat does have access to that information. And Mr. Ali had indicated that in his presentation he will speak to some of those elements. The last one was on, my apologies now. Okay, it was Mr. Ramatlakani's question on the data. And he was asking what are the challenges with the data. And the challenge is, I think, known to many. That the challenge is access. We struggle to get access to the information. But that is improving, and we're hoping that it will, or we're certain that it will continue to improve. So once we have access, the capacity of the Civilian Secretariat to analyze that information and to present it in a manner that is palatable to the public will hopefully improve. What I wanted to say in closing is that I'm a policy analyst by background. So when I came to the summit, I came with the attitude to listen. So we are confronted with a policy problem, and Cabinet has instructed us to come up with a solution. And the chairperson had initiated this event so that we can draw on the expertise that is in this room. So primarily the role of the Civilian Secretariat today and tomorrow is not to present expert information, but to present some of the facts, but primarily to listen, just to listen, to absorb, to interpret the solutions, the discussions that's being presented, and then to process it, and then to design a policy solution around that. So you must be patient with us if we're not going to be talking too much. We're not here to impose our views on anyone. We're just here to listen. Thank you.
And thank you for listening. It's tea. Can we ask the panel to be up here by 25:02? Then we're not running a little too late, and I'll try to manage the time from there. There's some drinks at the back. Ask Bulkers and others where the bathrooms are if you don't know. And we'll ask the panel to reconvene at about 25:02. Thank you. And also in the tea, get to speak to the people around. Wamkili, I love that word. Isn't it a brilliant word, Wamkili? All people with red underwear are apparently supposed to wear them on the outside. Well, I was told that they're not wearing their overalls because they don't want to intimidate me, so they are wearing their underwear. So. We've got 3 panelists who's going to be with us for the next 45 minutes or so. And they will ostensibly self-regulate, a word we haven't, or a phrase we haven't heard today yet, self-regulation. Whoopee! Which is what I expect of all of you, exercising leadership as the day continues and tomorrow. The impact of gun culture in South Africa, or on our society particularly. We have three panelists: Professor Van As, Sebastian Van As, from Red Cross Children's Hospital, Dr. Graham Block, in a whole different guise, but doing what his passion is as an education specialist, and Dr. Lane Benjamin, who's a psychologist with CASE and not a psychiatrist with us, SCORNA. So if you want to amend your program, please go ahead and do so. And I'm pretty much going to leave it up to the panel to regulate their own time and inputs and take their own questions. Is that okay? So thank you very much, and over to you.
Chair, Portfolio Committee, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm feeling very honored to be invited to this house and do a presentation. My talk will be quite different from this morning, which had lots of theoretical talks, but I'll be talking about the impact of gun culture on society. My name is Sebastian, and I work as a surgeon in the Red Cross Children's Hospital, and I am in charge of the trauma unit for the last 15 years. So we are a university hospital, so we are affiliated with the University of Cape Town. So we all know that violence is a leading cause of death. And if you look at this graph, which is a graph from the MRC, you can see that from all causes of death, firearms is one of the biggest. In the year 2000, more than 800 children were killed by firearms. The total number of homicides in that year was 25,000, and over 50% of the murders were committed with firearms. There were also 22,000 attempted murders with firearms. So I'm talking about the effect of guns on society, and we know that men take the biggest brunt, but women and children are often not talked about, and I will decide to talk about these two groups. So on women, we know that legal firearms and women killed. The ownership of legal firearms was strongly associated with women killed, and it was to such an extent that there was a 7-time greater risk of being murdered by an intimate partner if he owned a legal gun. So if a wife was married to someone with a gun, there's a 7 times higher chance that she's murdered. And the National Femicide Study at the time showed that from 1147, 1 in 3 of all women killed were killed by firearms. So nearly half of them were killed by their intimate partner. That were 405 women. So the suicide with legal guns, 1 in 5 of the perpetrators committed suicide after killing a partner, and many of them had a legal gun. So 80% of these double murders could have been prevented. Just a word on security workers and legal guns. 10% of the men who killed their partners were employed as a security worker, and 89% of these security workers used legal guns. So this is just a short introduction of the effect of guns on women, but my specialty, of course, is working in the Children's Hospital, looking and studying the effect of guns on children. So what we did, we performed a systematic review over the last 20 years, from 1991 to 2000, and we looked at all the children which were admitted with any form of accident or injury, and we looked at all the firearm-related children. Now, you have to know that in our hospital, we only treat children up to the age of 12. The definition of a child, most organizations and international institutions would agree, is up to 18, but in our hospital, for logistic reasons, we only treat up to 12, so only young children. And we drain only the western part of Cape Town. The eastern part of Cape Town is draining to Tygerberg Hospital. So we treat about 10,000 children with injuries each year. So we looked at the children coming with gunshots, and in the last 20 years we saw a total of 476 children under the age of 12 who were admitted after being shot. Now, it is very important to understand the difference of a child and an adult. The majority of adults who are shot on purpose. Someone takes the gun, there's a fight, and aims at the other person and kills him. Children are hit in a completely different mechanism. Children, and the vast majority of them, are hit in crossfire. So there is a fight somewhere, a bullet is flying through the community, or multiple bullets are flying, and a child happens to be there and catches the bullet. So they represent a measurement of the amount of guns fired in the society. So it's a very important indicator of what's going on in the society. So caught in crossfire is by far the most common category. Then of course they can also be shot deliberately by an adult or by another child, or they can be playing with a gun. Sometimes they're shot by gangsters and sometimes it's accidental. This morning there was talking about stabbings and gunshots, and it was not a big difference. For a surgeon and for the person, the victim, there's a huge difference. And this is just a picture of a 11-year-old girl who was standing at the bus stop waiting for the school bus, and there was a fight and one of the bullets went into her leg. Now you can see the effects of a bullet. When it hits the bone, it fragments into lots of little pieces called shrapnel, and it really destroys a big area. So it's not only the entrance and the exit wound, it's a much bigger impact what it has on these children. This is another child. It's a 2-year-old child, and it's another typical example of one of the children we get. It was a child of a policeman. The policeman had a nervous breakdown. He was home with his gun, and he decided, he had a big fight with his wife. He decided he has to kill his wife. So he took out his legal gun, his police gun, tried to shoot his wife. His wife was carrying the baby, and the bullet went through the spine of the spinal cord of the child. You can see this is an MRI. You can see the bullet tract going through the neck of the child. Now this child became paralyzed from the neck downwards, and she's now living in an institution. She will never be able to talk or to walk and to function normally. She'll be paralyzed for the rest of her life. This is a little boy, 8-year-old boy, the son of a security guard, and the security guard went home with his gun, left the gun. A 6-year-old picked up the gun, one of his other children, and shot his sibling. So he came and we operated him, and he was fine afterwards. This is a child from the Cape Flats. This is a poor family. They stay in a Wendy house with wooden walls. During the night there was a gang fight. So they heard some shooting, but they were not concerned. Then in the morning they went to pick up their child from the cot, and one of the bullets had gone through the wall of the Wendy house into the child. And you can see the bullet was sitting next to the heart. This is a chest X-ray. You can see the big bullet next to this child's. This was another little boy. There was a gang fight, and he was shot by a stray bullet, and hit by 2 bullets actually. And this is the last picture I'm going to show. It's a small baby, less than 1 year. This year we already had a few of them who were shot by stray bullets through the head. And most of them will result in terrible injury, and this child didn't make it. He was in intensive care for a few days when he died. So where are these kids shot? Now, of course, we all know that most of the violence is occurring in certain areas, but what from the child perspective is very important is that the child is not shot far away from his home. He's in the house or in the yard where he lives and grows up, and that's where they're shot. So they're really, these stray bullets are a danger for them in their own place. So we all know that about 14 years ago now, the new firearm bill came, and it's very complicated. I mean, there's hundreds of pages, but for me, I think what made the biggest impact was raising the minimum age from 16 to 21, the competency certificate, as well as the gun-free zones. And I think that is crucial in the bill. Now, we all know that the first hearings were in 2000. The law was adopted in 2002 and then implemented in 2004. Now, looking at the number of children coming to the Red Cross Children's Hospital, you can see that from 1991 to 2000, there was a dramatic increase from less than 10 to 40. So then the new firearm bill came into place, and it led to a reduction of about 70%. So it really had a massive impact, and we saw far less children. Now, the effect is not only on children. This is the effect on people being murdered in the various cities. And you can see, if you look at the green line here, this graph, the green line is Cape Town. The number of people being murdered in Cape Town nearly halved from 2001 to 2005. Now, we know this has to be an effect of the new firearm. It's not a general trend that suddenly people in Cape Town became friendlier. Because if you look on the right side, this is the non-firearm death. They were remaining exactly the same. They are flat. It was only the number of gun-related deaths which dropped in these years. Now, they always tell me they need a firearm to protect themselves. Is this true? From studies in the United States, it shows that from all shots fired in the home or in the yard, only 3% are in self-defense. So you've got your gun to defend yourself, but only 3% of the shots fired are in self-defense, and half of them are in self-defense against the partner. So basically it's a domestic fight in which one of the people grabs the gun which is in the house and shoots the partner. So if you do not take this into account, it means that the chance, if you've got a gun, the chance that you'll use it in self-defense against a stranger is 1.5%. So there is 40 times bigger chance that your gun is going to be used against you or your family or your friends. So this is just something to remember. Now, we all know that from studies in our own country, 84% of violent crimes involve a firearm. And of people who possess a firearm for self-defense, the chance that they wear it at the moment that you're attacked is very small. You can imagine if you've got a gun in your house and there's a burglar jumping over the wall, your gun is probably in the safe, or you're not carrying that gun all the time on you. So there's a very small chance that you actually, even if you've got a gun for self-defense, that you're actually carrying it at the moment you're attacked. So the people who've got a firearm for self-defense, they are 4 times more likely to have it stolen than actually that they use it for self-defense. And of course, we know where it goes. So what do we want? This is a picture from the United States. And it's a society saturated with guns. We all know that. And you can have a gun from the age of 16. And that is the only reason there are so many shootings. But I think it's amazing that a country which is in war in Afghanistan, as we know, for every soldier which dies in the war in Afghanistan, 13 children lose their life from gun-related violence. So just that ratio. Now, even in our own, this is just clippings I took from yesterday from the newspaper, and guns which were supposedly destroyed in Gauteng ended up in Cape Town. So with other words, a policeman or a security person not doing his job in Gauteng, he can kill, that can cost the life of a child in Cape Town. Now, I've only talked about the physical effects predominantly on children. But what about the psychological and long-term effects? Of course, we all know it's very negative. I've got lots of stories in the hospital from parents and a family of kids who have got nightmares, they can't sleep. Their marks at school are going dramatically down just because one child was shot in the class. And these kids, they go to school and they fear for their life. So it really has got a massive impact on them. And the guns are celebrated in the media. If you watch any TV channel, South African TV channel or private TV channel on Friday night, there's all these Skiet, Kop and Donner, murder and mayhem. What is interesting is that in all these movies and series, the person who pulls the trigger is usually the hero. He is the one who's celebrated. We never see the long-term effect It's never visualized. What happens to the person, what happens to a child when they're shot, when they paralyzed the rest of their life, how they sit in the wheelchair. We don't see that on TV. So children, it's known that children who grow up in an area with guns, they think it's normal and they are much more likely to start using them when they grow up. So in conclusion, Chair, guns have a devastating effect on our society. There is no doubt about that. Children are disproportionately affected by guns because they're always innocent. They are not the ones who are shooting, they're the ones being shot. And remember, in South Africa, 40% of our society are children. So 40%, 20 million, we've got 53 million South Africans, 20 million of them are children. They are sitting ducks, they are being shot by stray bullets, and they're taking the brunt. So I really strongly would recommend that the minimum age for a gun would be elevated to 25 years. And the reason for that is that your decision-making process to understand the future consequences of your acts, you need your frontal lobe, and your frontal lobe, which is the important part in this decision-making, is only maturing at the age of 25. So I think we can make a difference, and we did make a difference. We saw this number of children from 91 to 2000, which was increasing rapidly. Then we had a new firearm bill, so it was very successful, we dropped. And then we know that there were very few licenses issued in this period. But then, because of the backlog, in 2011, the South African Police Service, there was a backlog and they licensed they gave license of about 1 million licenses in 8 months' time. And we'll see what happened. There's no doubt in my mind that this massive increase is a direct result of 1 million weapons which were rolling into the society. So I would like to end with quoting Nelson Mandela. He said a better society should be measured by the happiness and the welfare of children. So not in economic welfare and the size of your house or your salary, but how kids are doing. And kids are starting to do again very bad. So I really think that these amendments are helping towards that, and I think the new firearm bill should be made more effective. And I thank you for your attention.
I think I'll probably not give as many facts as the good doctor has given. But let me start by addressing the Portfolio Committee, who I think are actually the most important people here. So all protocols observed, but greetings to the Portfolio Committee. And let me just also say I'm not a doctor. I have 2 MAs, but I'm not a doctor. And it's very bad to call yourself a doctor if you're not a doctor, I'm told. And nor am I in the DBSA. I did work for them, but I'm no longer in the DBSA. So let me begin. And as I say, I think there are people here who probably know more than I do, and who certainly have more statistics than I have. So I'm going to speak about schools and violence in schools, where I think it's unacceptable to have the levels of violence that we have. School should be a safe haven where you feel loved. Going to school, going on your way there, is not a place to be raped. Bullying should stop at school. Gangsters have no place, and guns at home or school have little or no place either. So I've tracked some of the different forms of violence. Why feel safe at school? Well, I think especially given the terrible home circumstances of many kids, often just a hug or some love is what gets you through, whether a day or the year of achievements. And let me say, I'm not being silly there or self-gratifying, that I think that your attitude does determine your altitude. And teachers can hardly tackle the inequalities that make poverty or hunger so much a reality for our young. Now, I know we tend to blame teachers, but teachers are hardly to blame for these issues. While we as the public have much to blame them for, as we can see, many teachers put their hands in their pockets to feed or transport youngsters in their charges, or to make sure that school is a place they can feel safe.
And I really do feel for teachers who have to deal with gangs at school. Heads of school or officials have much to do to make sure schools run smoothly. The more smooth the school, the harder to intervene or to disrupt. The better run the department, the easier to devise strategies to combat what is now a national problem. It's not just a Western Cape problem. Discuss these with the learners. They also hate disruption. That's the bottom line. Kids hate disruption. I'm opposed to guns or police in schools. So it doesn't help, as I say, and let's debate it, mostly to have metal detectors or cops at the gates. The hidden lessons of the hidden curriculum are much too problematic. So I think chase the drugs, chase the kids, chase the violence, but don't chase the kids themselves. Where do guns at schools come from? Where do communities disintegrate? Why do people who call themselves leaders close schools or make their kids leave school for political ends or burn schools? I think we've got to ask these questions. While we want more parental involvement in school, often they will get it wrong, and they do get it wrong. And yet, guns in the hands of young people are even worse than guns in the hands of older people. Where do they get these guns? From guns in the hands of their elders, or from the militarized police if they supply a gang, as we've seen happening from Joburg. There's much to do to end inequality and poverty, to remove violence from our communities and schools, to remove guns from the hands of kids and knives, and thus to free our schools. Thank you.
Okay, while they sort the technology out, just a couple of things. I saw hands shoot up immediately. I'm going to encourage those of you who have asked a question before to give space for others to ask their questions. I'm going to ask you to ask a question and not make a statement. Trust that someone else will actually ask your question. Remember, this is a dialogue, so trust that someone else will ask the question or make the statement that you actually sitting with. Questions will be taken after Dr. Benjamin has spoken. Is that okay? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, my presentation seems to have disappeared into cyberspace, but that's okay. Yeah, good afternoon. Sorry? Case Lane Benjamin. Don't worry, it's fine. Okay, so we've all heard the statement, guns don't kill people, people with guns kill people, and that often gets bandied about when there are debates around firearms. So I really want to talk about people who kill people, sometimes with guns. I've been working in the Cape Flats, so that is the context out of which I'm speaking. I've been running an organization for the last 15 years in Hanover Park, and more recently Manenberg and Lavender Hill. So my concern really is more about illicit gun use. And so I'm looking forward to hearing what the other panelists have to say after me. And obviously, naturally, I'm not a huge believer in stats, so I don't really have many, but because they are debatable and contentious. So I am speaking from my experiences on the ground and from the people with whom I work, people who live in the communities with violence, who no offense to the academics, I consider the experts in the field, and from whom I've learned quite a lot. So I want to move the focus slightly off firearms, if I may. I did wonder why I was here, but my specialist area is trauma, so that's what I want to talk to you about. And to look at how we understand the roots of violence. Otherwise, I don't really understand why we're having this conversation, or the one part of this conversation. So, and gun violence is part of that conversation. But I think a big problem that we have in this country is that we tend to think in silos about some of the big issues. Be it violence, drugs, gangs, teen sexuality, whatever the issue. So many of these things are so intrinsically connected, but we have these debates and discussions about them in isolation, and we don't see the bigger picture. And I know it's overwhelming, and it's easier to focus on one thing at a time. But at some point, we have to get messy and start looking at it all together. So that is what I'm going to try and bring in the mental health perspective of violence. So for me, at the heart of many of our social ills, for lack of a better term, is really the effect of generations of violence and trauma which permeate our society. And in the organization that I've been working in, we've really been looking at trying to reconceptualize what trauma is in South Africa, because we, as we normally do, we take on a lot of Western models. With regard to my area, we take on post-traumatic stress disorder as the be-all and end-all of understanding trauma and treatment and interventions. But from my experience in working in communities, there is no post-traumatic stress disorder. It is continuous because people are living in violence daily, in their homes, on the streets, and in the community. So we've had to change how we work in this environment, and we need to start thinking as South Africans to develop real solutions to our own problems. But at the same time, the patterns that we've seen around our generations of violence, and we can go back pre-colonialism and not just get stuck in apartheid, but it's impacted our individuals, our families and communities in multi-systemic ways. And we're not unique in that it's the same kinds of patterns that we see in research in other cultural communities like Aborigines in Australia, Native Americans in India, where over 5 or 6 generations, since colonialism, you see an increase in domestic violence, an increase in child abuse, increase in substance and alcohol abuse, a marked, significant lack of father figures, and an increase in interpersonal violence as well. And that has certainly been mirrored in the patterns that I've seen in Anova Park and in the Cape Flats as well, where it's not just an increased level of violence, in interpersonal violence, but the intensity and the nature of violence is also increased, as well as much younger children being engaged in acts of violence. So in order to address this, we need to understand why. Because by the time that this kind of child has a gun in his hand, we're having this discussion a little too late. So it doesn't matter who you are, violence affects everyone. And becoming a perpetrator of violence is not determined by your race or your socioeconomic status. We've seen that in this country. However, in South Africa, we know violence is disproportionately skewed to lower income geographic areas. And we also know that black men and boys are disproportionately affected by violence, trauma, poverty, unemployment, and high incarceration rates. So just to kind of bring home the context of what the kids that I'm working with are living in. We did a study in Anova Park. The slide would have been great here, but it is actually in your file. We did a study with 617 12 to 15-year-old adolescents looking at the rates of violence exposure. And nearly 99% of that group had witnessed community violence. 69% had seen someone get shot in the neighborhood. 41% had witnessed someone threatening another with a gun. Nearly half had seen a dead body in the street, excluding funerals. 93% had experienced more than one type of violence, and 55% had experienced 4 more types of violence. So, I mean, I'm giving you the stats, but hopefully you'll believe me from what I've seen that this is normal for us. This is what we see every day. But it's a high rate of polyvictimization that these kids are experiencing. And these statistics show that our kids are growing up in war zones. And this kind of exposure desensitizes them to violence and to death, and on some level actually prepares them to kill. So the effects of generational and continuous trauma are very complex, and they're multifaceted, and I can't go into all of the details, and I don't really understand all of it. I'm still learning. But I do want to highlight two major effects that are significant to this discussion. Firstly, people become neuropsychologically programmed for survival. When you're living in a state of chronic trauma and violence, it is going to change your brain, and there's lots of studies to prove that. The brain develops pathways in response to our human experience, to our environments, and that's going to determine the social maps your brain creates, and it's going to influence your human behavior and your action. So your brain's main mission is to keep you alive in this kind of environment, because safety is the priority. And in order to protect us, we all have our fight, flight, freeze mechanism. But when violence is a lifetime experience, it results in the brain almost becoming incubated in terror and quite threat-orientated and aggressive. So the child's brain becomes wired for threat, and they become so attuned to danger that they will see danger even when it doesn't exist. Consequently, also this response leads to children become quite disconnected from their own feelings and the feelings of others, and it limits their capacity for rational thinking. They're operating on their primitive survival brain, which is impulsive and aggressive and reactive. And that's a pattern we see consistently in children, in youth, and in their parents. Families, as I think has been mentioned, are not able to provide nurturing, safe spaces for kids in which to grow, because many of the parents themselves function on their primitive survival brain, and they haven't had many good, healthy parenting role models in their community to emulate. So children learn that they cannot trust adults, they cannot trust their parents, and because they have so much exposure to violence and trauma, it repeatedly shatters their ability to trust. And when you can't trust, you can't easily connect with human beings, which reduces your capacity for empathy, which makes it much easier to kill or harm someone else. And of course, we can't have a discussion about guns, gangs, whatever, without talking about drugs. In the context in which I work, drugs are easily available. It's a good option if you actually can't cope with these overwhelming negative emotions. But it escalates your impulsivity and your ability to control your own emotions. Secondly, in violent environments, people feel powerless. And I think that's another big important discussion that we don't address enough of in this country, is power and oppression across the board. Violence is modeled as a solution to achieving power and control in an environment where people feel disempowered and where trauma repeatedly takes away your control. And children who are growing up in families where they witness violence, they kind of internalize this violence and use it in a way to resolve everyday forms of conflict. The other thing is that we daily see, which is really sad, we see authority figures, other than parents, reinforce trauma in the way that they disrespect and disempower and humiliate and dehumanize young people in the community, especially in poor communities. And I've seen it multiple times where it's actually ended up pushing that young person into the direction of becoming a perpetrator. A teacher who bullies a young grade R, tells him, your father's in prison, you're going to end up just like your father. A policeman who I witnessed pulling down a young innocent boy's pants in a search, but in front of the whole community and in front of his peers. Now, in a background of injustice in this country and all forms of racial prejudice and other forms of prejudice, that creates a toxic combination for legitimizing aggression and violence. Now, given the context that a lot of these children are living in, I want you just to imagine a 10-year-old boy who's growing up in this kind of environment. You are aware of the socioeconomic issues. He's feeling dehumanized, he's disconnected from himself, and his first offense is that he involves him stabbing another little girl in his class with a pen because she gave him a look that his brain interpreted as being threatening. Now that kind of case comes across my desk at least 3 times a year, if not a younger age. But it's those innocuous situations which this kind of terror-incubated brain interprets, misinterprets, and it escalates into arguments and misunderstandings, and ultimately these fatal cycles of revenge. But our society has created ways for this little boy to enact that aggression through making it easy for him to join a gang and be recruited into a gang, and makes it easy for him to get his hands on a gun. And by the time he's 14, he may have killed a few people. By the time he's 18, he's going to be in Pollsmoor for murder. But having a gun gives this boy access to the things that he needs. He needs the power, he needs the safety, he needs control, he needs a brotherhood, he needs a family, and he needs a means to generate income. And this is what it provides in that context. And like many children, this boy has learned that violence is morally acceptable when you're feeling disrespected and threatened. But it's these kinds of messages that he's learned that are learned in the family. And they are reinforced through the culture of the community, and they're still being ignored by our society. And because pulling the trigger of a gun is so efficient, it's so quick, it doesn't require much social investment, that's what makes it dangerous in that context. Sadly, I also have to say that this kind of response is quite normal. And having worked in the mental health field, I've come to see that violence is never senseless. If you look at the psychological state of families and communities, it makes sense. And we've termed it the impacts of this kind of trauma as negative resilience, because it's a way of surviving a dangerous environment. It's not an illness, it's not a disease, it's survival. Which doesn't mean that we condone the acts, but we've got to start reframing how we understand these concepts. We've also had a number of conversations with some of the youth about guns in the last month, just to get their input on what they think are the solutions to some of the problems that they're experiencing, because they are exposed to illicit guns daily. And I wanted to put up one or two quotes. I had many, but a big thing for them that they raised is that we need to end corruption, obviously, locally, at local and international spaces, but especially the process that, as has also been mentioned, that facilitates illegal repossessed guns being put back into circulation. There's lots of anecdotal quotes that we have about guns that have been repossessed and they're found back in the community. So that is a serious problem. And without trust in the police system, it doesn't matter how strict our gun laws are. They're not going to affect the issues of crime and violence that we're experiencing on the community level. Because we can have strict gun laws, but if the police don't have the infrastructure and the support and the resources to implement and follow through on the law, it's going to continue to break the trust in the system, no matter how well-intentioned it is. But beyond removing illegal guns, the most important thing is that we need to find ways to disarm the minds of the people who are living with aggression. Otherwise, the aggression is going to remain, and they will find other ways to act out that aggression. And you can remove all the guns, but ultimately they're going to find ways to enact that aggression through making zip guns, which we see a lot of in the community. They will use knives, they will use fists, bricks, sexual violence, but it's not dealing with the unresolved trauma that we're sitting with. And a good example, which another mental health expert in Glasgow said, was Glasgow is the knifing capital of Europe. But he said that if we had the rates of gun availability as the US, we would be the most violent nation in the world, because guns are so instant if they're not regulated properly. But we need to also start looking at not just mortality and death statistics. We have to look at the assault statistics, because that's actually the real data. And I think we need to start looking at real solutions to a much broader set of problems, of which gun violence is one of them. The only way to stop it being taken and to take it more seriously is to make mental health a priority in this country. Too often we don't want to address trauma because it's ugly and it's complicated and it's messy. But we're going to have to. And I think civil society has taken the brunt of this work on themselves with very few resources. And I think they get what I'm saying, but I don't think there are actually many of them here, which is also a bit sad. It is also not one sector or one department's responsibility to provide solutions. I mean, if you look at education, if you look at health, social development, poverty, all these different departments, where are we not affected by trauma, personally and professionally? The effects of trauma are pervasive and they require various solutions. But solutions that are not just about a program that begins here and ends here or an intervention. It actually requires relationship and process. of integrity. Otherwise, the trauma of violence and injustice and oppression is going to continue to shape our future. So just to close, to effect real transformation, we can't just look brightly into the future, but we actually each in this room need to take responsibility as a parent, as a teacher, as a policeman or woman, as a government official, as an adult, for really addressing the pain of our own past, but also at looking at the role that we play in perpetuating cycles of violence in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. I've got a question to Ms. Kirsten, Dr. Jadan, and Advocate Hood. If we started 2:15, would that impact your daily schedule? Your schedule for today? Are you with us till this afternoon? Okay. Can I get it, Dr. Jadan? You okay with that? I mean, not Dr. Jadan, but who's standing in for Dr. Jadan? Sorry, Advocate Norman.
I also don't want to be called the doctor.
Okay, we'll call you an advocate at where you are. Sorry.
I represent some of them sometimes. No, I'll be okay for quarter.
Okay, thanks very much.
Dr. Jadan.
Right. Then the second thing is, I've seen a number of people who haven't spoken before. We're going to ask you to ask questions of clarification so that you understand where they're coming from. If you have a comment, keep it short. And we're also going to limit you to one question. If you've spoken before, I'm going to take it upon myself. And I'm going to take it upon you that you're going to exercise leadership and some grace and some tolerance for the chair to invite someone else who hasn't spoken to speak first. Is that okay? I know you're all sitting with burning issues, and we're going to go for the next 15 minutes, so we'll go till 2:45, and then we'll have the next panel reconvene at 2:15. Is that okay? And then the outcome section that's on year 2, that will be a time for discussion, so you can take away the outcomes. If you have a question now, you have a comment, write it down. We'll also accommodate it later in the afternoon. Chair's prerogative. So thank you for showing such grace. Can we now have those people who haven't spoken before? 2 gentlemen on my side, I've acknowledged you. 3, anybody else? I'll take 4 questions. I'm going to ignore the 2 of you, the one is at the back. Thank you. So those are the 4 that I've acknowledged, and we'll take it from there. If you can keep it brief, we'll all appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. My name is Ludwig Chur. I'm in a personal capacity. I am presenting a Facebook group who asked me to speak on their behalf, specifically to say not to criminalize us. Being graceful, I would like to compliment Professor Sebastian van As and Dr. Bloch. I've read their research reports. I have many questions, but I will limit it to one. And Dr. Benjamin, unfortunately, I didn't manage to find any research of yours, and I would appreciate if I can get copies of all the research. I have one question, but it's addressed to all 3. And I must admit, I'm not allowed to make speeches. I do agree with a lot of what you said, so I won't go over that. And I'm just mentioning it so that I don't come over as negative, please. My question to all 3 is, I have also done some research in this respect, and it seems like knives are a major part. If we look at SA stats, it's 95% or 85%, depending. I've also spoken to groups here who work with schools, and they also confirmed that knives is a big part. So my question to all 3 is, I hear what you say about guns, and I agree. And just to speak about the portion of knives, and with Dr. Sebastian van As, perhaps if I can just add one additional one. Your cases that you mentioned, I think it was 476, something like that. If you could also just indicate how many of those were resulted in deaths and how many were not even admitted to hospital, according to your own research. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day. My name is Johan Skuman. I'm here on behalf of Gun Owners South Africa. As that representative, I'm basically representing 1.8 million South Africans who demonstrably make up the most law-abiding section of society. For Professor Sebastian van As, he has firstly brought up the claim often repeated that a gun in the house is 4 times more likely to be used against the owner than in self-defense. And the source for that claim is a study conducted by Mr. A. Altbeker. I've got a quote here. We have approached him to find out what his views were on the usage of his data. And I'd like Professor van As to answer that, please. Mr. Altbeker is on record in his writings as stating that the methodology of the study militates against drawing the conclusion that armed victims are much more likely to lose their weapons than to use them successfully. That is from the researcher that is quoted for those statistics, and I'd like Professor van As's response on that, please. For Mr. Bloch, I think you asked interesting questions. Where do communities disintegrate? Why do people who call themselves leaders close schools or make their kids leave school for political ends? And I think Dr. Benjamin answered you beautifully in that. That was a really very good answer on where it comes from, the violence in society that we're sitting with. Professor van As showed us very graphic images, which is very sad. And the golden thread that runs through that for me is poverty.